Hello, my fellow story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was the summer of 2007 when I first found myself involved in an experience I could never shake off. At the time, I was living in a small town in the Midwest. I wasn't expecting much in terms of excitement from life, just the usual routines that come with being a young man in his late 20s. I worked as a construction worker, spending my days doing physical labor, and my nights with a close-knit group of friends at the local diner. Life was simple, and everything felt grounded in the real world. The biggest challenge I faced was staying awake during the late-night shifts at the site. My life was pretty ordinary. There was no drama, no surprises, and I was perfectly fine with that. I was content with the usual, but sometimes, just sometimes, I felt like I was waiting for something to happen. It was during one of those summer nights that I first heard about the old hospital on the edge of town. I hadn't given it much thought at first. Abandoned buildings were a dime a dozen in places like ours. I wasn't afraid of them though. My friends and I often joked about how, as kids, we dared each other to sneak into these buildings. Of course, none of us had the guts to stay in them after dark. Still, the old hospital was different. There was an unsettling silence that surrounded it, and even the bravest of us never ventured near it. It was said to be haunted, a place where terrible things had happened decades ago. But it was also a place that felt forgotten. One evening, while we were all gathered at the diner, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Someone brought up the hospital one of those nights when you're just looking for something to talk about, and someone else mentioned that it was up for demolition. A few of the guys had heard about some strange noises that came from it on quiet nights. They said they'd heard things shuffling, faint voices, the sound of doors creaking open. None of us took it seriously, of course. It was just another urban legend, one of those stories that gets passed around in small towns where there's not much else to talk about. But there was one guy, Mark, who seemed to know more about it than the rest of us. Mark was a bit of an outsider, a quiet guy who kept to himself. He wasn't the type to indulge in town gossip, and when he mentioned that he had actually been inside the hospital once, the conversation shifted from casual chatter to something more curious. "I wouldn't go back in there, not after what I saw," Mark said, his voice low, as if he were afraid of being overheard. "I don't know what happened, but there's something wrong with that place. It's not just an old building, it's something else." The rest of us exchanged skeptical glances. Mark had always been the type to get lost in his head. He often spoke of strange things, stories that didn't make sense, but we all had the sense that he believed what he was saying. There was a look in his eyes that unsettled me. That's when he made an offer none of us could ignore. "Why don't we check it out?" he suggested. "We could go tonight. It's just a building. What's the worst that could happen?" The others chuckled at first, but as we went on about our plans for the night, a part of me couldn't shake the thought of the hospital. I had lived here my whole life, but I had never stepped foot inside. I didn't know anyone who had, except for Mark. And somehow, his words had a weight to them that I couldn't ignore. That night, my friends and I, Mark included, met up at the diner after our shifts. We didn't think much about what we were doing, at least not at first. It was just a spur-of-the-moment decision, a dare to ourselves to explore the unknown. We didn't know what we were walking into, but in our small town, this was as close to an adventure as we'd ever get. As we piled into the old truck and drove to the outskirts of town, I felt a strange mix of excitement and uncertainty. When we arrived, the old hospital loomed in the distance, shrouded in shadows. Its windows were cracked, and the walls seemed to sag under the weight of time. A faint breeze stirred the overgrown grass, and a chill ran through me, though it was a warm summer night. We got out of the truck, and I glanced around, trying to peer through the darkness. The silence was so thick, it felt suffocating. We stood there for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. Mark led the way, as if he'd done this before, even though I knew he hadn't. He reached for the rusted gates of the hospital, which creaked open with an eerie groan. "Let's go," Mark said softly, as if urging us to follow. We hesitated for a moment, but then, one by one, we all stepped inside. The interior of the hospital was even more unsettling than I had imagined. The air smelled stale, like old paper and dust, and the floorboards creaked under our weight. We wandered through the hallways, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. There were old, broken-down gurneys, discarded medical equipment, and peeling wallpaper that seemed to tell the story of a place long forgotten. But as we explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The silence was oppressive, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified in the stillness. Mark led us deeper into the hospital, past rooms that looked as though they had been untouched for decades. It was hard to believe that anyone had been here in years, but something about the place didn't sit right with me. It felt wrong. There was a sense that the walls held secrets, that this hospital was more than just an abandoned building. Something lingered in the air, something I couldn't see but could almost feel. We moved through the dark hallways, whispering to each other in low voices. But all of a sudden, there was a noise that cut through the silence, a soft shuffling sound, like something dragging along the floor. We froze. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't one of us. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been there. I turned to Mark, who had stopped in his tracks. His face had gone pale, and his eyes were wide with fear. Without saying a word, he motioned for us to stay quiet. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to listen, but the sound had stopped. We waited in the dark, the only sound the pounding of our own hearts. I felt my breath catch in my throat, a lump of fear forming deep in my chest. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run back to the truck and never look back, but something kept me frozen, unable to move. It was like the building itself was holding us in place, unwilling to let us go. Finally, Mark took a step forward, and we reluctantly followed. We moved down the hallway, trying to ignore the sensation that we were being watched. The closer we got to the heart of the hospital, the more intense the feeling became. It wasn't just the dark, the silence, or the eerie atmosphere. It was something more. Something ancient and wrong. Something alive. We stood in that hallway, the oppressive silence stretching on, each of us waiting for something to happen, though none of us could say exactly what we were expecting. The hospital was eerily still, as though time had forgotten it, leaving only the remnants of a place once filled with life. The air was thick with dust, and the musty smell of old paper and mold lingered in our noses. But something about the space felt off, like we were trespassing in a place that had long been sealed off from the world. As we moved deeper into the building, the noise, the shuffling sound lingered in my mind. It had been so faint, but there was no mistaking it. Something had been there. I could almost feel it in my bones, that creeping sensation that something was just out of sight, waiting. But I wasn't the only one who noticed it. I saw it in the others' faces too. Mark's usual calm demeanor had faded, replaced with a look of uncertainty I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just nervousness, it was something more primal, something unsettling. We reached the end of the hallway, and the silence seemed to grow even thicker, like a physical presence pressing in on us. The others were still talking in hushed voices, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the walls themselves were listening to us. Then, out of nowhere, there was a sound that shattered the silence. A faint tapping, followed by a soft scraping noise, like nails being dragged slowly across the floor. It was subtle, but it was there close, too close. We all stopped in our tracks, the sound of our footsteps silenced by the noise that seemed to come from nowhere, yet was everywhere. The tapping grew louder, and this time, it wasn't just my imagination. I saw it too. Mark's eyes widened, and I could feel the tension in the air. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to pinpoint the source of the sound, but it was impossible. It didn't seem to come from any specific direction. It felt as if it was echoing through the walls themselves, reverberating in the very air we breathed. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaky. The others nodded, their faces pale and wide-eyed. No one spoke for a moment. It was like the building itself had frozen us in place, our bodies paralyzed by whatever was happening. Mark, the most level-headed of us all, finally spoke. "We need to go," he said quietly, his voice tight. But it wasn't just fear in his voice. It was something deeper, something primal. It was the sound of a man who had encountered something he didn't understand, something that shouldn't have been there. We turned to leave, but as we moved back toward the front of the hospital, the sound seemed to follow us, a soft scraping, a shuffling. the same noise that had chilled my spine earlier. It wasn't just the walls now. It was everywhere, coming from the corners, the darkness, from the very air we were breathing. It felt like the building itself was alive, shifting, reacting to our presence. "Something's wrong here," one of my friends muttered under his breath. It wasn't just the noise now. There was a sense of being watched, of being followed. Each of us felt it, the weight of unseen eyes on us. I couldn't explain it, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my pulse quickened. We quickened our pace, but the sounds grew louder, more insistent, like a warning. It was as if whatever was in the building with us was trying to get our attention, pulling us deeper into the dark recesses of the hospital, pulling us towards something we couldn't see, but could feel pressing in on us. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step we took, like they were reaching out to grab us. I turned to Mark, but his face was pale, his expression far more serious than I had ever seen him. "Mark, what's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What did you see here?" He didn't answer right away, and for a moment I thought he might not speak at all. But then he looked over at me with a hard, unreadable gaze. "I told you," he said quietly. "This place isn't empty. It's not just abandoned. There's something here, and it doesn't want us here." The others glanced at each other uneasily. It was the first time anyone had said it aloud, the thing that had been hovering in the air since we walked into the hospital. The truth, or at least part of it. We weren't alone. We made our way back to the entrance, the footsteps and tapping echoing with us. Always just a step behind, never quite close enough to touch, but always there. The building seemed to warp around us, like the walls were shifting, closing in. We reached the doors, but they wouldn't open. They were locked, as though the building itself had trapped us inside. "Come on," one of my friends yelled, pulling at the door handle. "Open up." But the door didn't budge. Panic began to set in, creeping into our hearts like ice. What if we couldn't get out? What if this place had more control over us than we realized? The sound, the whispers, the strange feeling of being watched, it was all coming to a head. Mark stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "There's a back exit," he said, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for something or someone. He motioned for us to follow him, and we did, trying to keep our composure, even as the world around us felt increasingly unreal. As we made our way toward the back of the building, the noise grew louder still. The tapping had turned into something more deliberate, a rhythmic scraping, as though someone or something was methodically dragging something heavy behind us. The floorboards groaned under the weight of the sound. We hurried, but the tapping kept pace, always just behind us. When we reached the back door, Mark pulled at the handle, but it didn't give. "It's locked too," he muttered, frustration rising in his voice. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie stillness. For a moment, everything felt suspended, as though we were holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, suddenly, the door creaked open on its own. We rushed outside into the cool night air, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. I turned back toward the hospital, and in the dim light, I thought I saw something move in one of the windows. A figure dark, indistinct, looming in the shadows. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that whatever we had experienced inside, whatever was still there, wasn't something we could understand. It wasn't just the building, it was something older, something far more dangerous. We had only scratched the surface of what was waiting inside, and the thought of going back made my skin crawl. As we drove away, none of us spoke. There were no words that could capture what we had just experienced. But as the hospital receded into the distance, the feeling of being watched lingered, like the echoes of the sounds we'd heard, always just out of reach, but never far from our minds. We didn't talk about it again for days, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the tapping. And in the back of my mind, I knew whatever was in that hospital wasn't done with us yet. Not by a long shot. The days after our escape from the abandoned hospital felt like a fog had settled over all of us. We didn't speak about it. Not directly. Not in the way you'd expect when something like that happens. It was as if we were all waiting for the right moment to say something, waiting for one of us to break the silence first. But no one did. Instead, we moved on, as if we could ignore the eerie sounds that had followed us, as if the shadows we saw in the windows had been nothing more than figments of our imagination. But deep down, We all knew it wasn't over. That feeling, that heavy weight of dread, it hadn't gone away. In fact, it had followed us. At first, I thought it was just my nerves. Maybe I had been shaken up more than I wanted to admit. But then strange things started happening. Small things, at first, things you might dismiss as coincidence. I'd hear the sound of footsteps in my apartment late at night, too faint to be real, but loud enough to wake me. Or I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye shadows that didn't belong. Every creak of the floorboards in the quiet of my house, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed amplified, as if the building itself was trying to get my attention. And then, it wasn't just me. Mark called me one evening, his voice tight. "It's happening again," he said. The words were barely audible, but I could hear the panic underneath. "What do you mean?" I asked, a chill creeping down my spine. My thoughts immediately jumped back to the hospital, to that tapping sound that we could never escape, to the feeling of something following us, something waiting. "I don't know," he continued, "but I'm not imagining it. I can hear it. I don't know where it's coming from, but it's here." "Where?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The hospital." "I went back," he admitted. A heavy silence fell between us. I didn't know what to say. Why would he go back? After everything that had happened, why would he step foot in that place again? "You went back?" I asked, trying to keep the disbelief from my voice. "Why? What are you doing?" "I had to know," he replied, voice shaky. "I thought it was all in my head, but I was wrong. Something's still there. I know it. I can feel it." The air in the room seemed to grow colder, as if Mark's words had triggered something that had been lurking just beneath the surface of my thoughts. "What did you see?" "I didn't see anything," he said. But I heard it again, the same scraping sound. And the feeling, man, it was like something was watching me, following me. I felt a shiver run through me, and it wasn't from the cold. Mark was usually the practical one, the skeptic. If he was scared, then something serious was going on. "What are you going to do?" I asked, dreading the answer. "I don't know," he replied, his voice low. "But I need to go back again. I have to figure out what's going on. If I don't, I'll never be able to sleep again." The conversation ended with that, and I didn't hear from Mark for a few days. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. Each night, I woke up, heart pounding, as if the strange presence that haunted the hospital was now haunting me too. The shadows in my room seemed darker, heavier. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. I wasn't the only one affected. Days later, one of our other friends, Sam, called me late one night, his voice trembling. "I saw it," he said, barely able to contain his fear. "It's real." "Sam, what are you talking about?" I asked, trying to calm him down. "What did you see?" "I was walking down the street when I thought I saw someone in the window of the old hospital," he continued. "I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but I swear I saw it. There was someone standing there, just staring out at me." "Are you sure it wasn't just a reflection?" I asked. "It's an abandoned building. It could have been anything." "No," Sam replied, a note of desperation in his voice. "It was no reflection. It was a person. I could see them clearly. They were watching me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Sam wasn't the type to make things up. He wasn't prone to exaggeration or drama. And if he was saying this, then there was something to it. Something was wrong. The days grew longer, the air heavier. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. Mark still hadn't called me back, and the tension between the group was palpable. We all avoided the subject, though we knew we couldn't ignore it much longer. Something was coming, and none of us knew what it was, but we knew it would be worse than before. One afternoon, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I had to see it for myself. Maybe I could convince Mark to stop, to leave the hospital alone. Or maybe I could finally get answers to the questions that had been eating away at me since the day we first set foot inside that cursed building. I didn't know, but I had to try. The hospital loomed in the distance as I approached, and just looking at it made my stomach churn. The silence around it was suffocating, as if the air itself was unwilling to touch the building. Every step I took toward the front doors felt like I was walking into the mouth of a beast, a predator waiting for me to make the wrong move. I reached the entrance, my hand trembling as I pushed open the door. The air inside was stale and suffocating, But it wasn't the smell that unsettled me. It was the stillness. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no birds singing outside. Just dead silence. I called out, my voice echoing in the vast emptiness. "Mark, are you here?" No answer. The silence grew heavier, and I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. I could feel it then, the same presence that had haunted us before. It was back, watching, waiting. The walls seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against me, suffocating me. I moved deeper into the hospital, every creak of the floorboards underfoot amplified in the dead silence. I heard the tapping again, not in the distance this time, but right behind me. It was getting closer, the scraping sound dragging itself across the floor, as if someone or something was inching forward, stalking me. I turned, heart pounding, but the hall was empty. Nothing, just darkness. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here any longer. But as I turned back to leave, I saw something in the shadows, a figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. My heart stopped. The air froze in my lungs. The tapping stopped, and the silence was deafening. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing down on me. I turned and ran, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I don't know what I saw that day, but I know it was real. Something is inside that hospital, and I don't think it's ever going to leave. The days following my encounter at the hospital felt like they were stretching on forever, each moment weighed down by the unseen force that seemed to be closing in on us. There was no escaping it anymore. It wasn't just the strange noises or the feeling of being watched. There was something far more sinister, something that none of us had expected. No matter how many times we had discussed it, how many times we had brushed it off. After that night in the hospital, I couldn't shake the images of that shadowy figure watching me. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, I knew in my gut that it wasn't. And then the dreams began. Night after night, I would wake in a cold sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The same dark figure standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel. I tried to stay away from the hospital. I really did. But I wasn't the only one. Mark had been silent since his last phone call, and I hadn't heard from him in days. Sam, too, had gone quiet. Something wasn't right, and the feeling of dread only deepened the longer I waited. I knew I couldn't avoid it much longer. I needed answers, and so did the others. It was only a matter of time before we would have to confront whatever was waiting for us in that decaying building. I made the decision to go back. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want to drag them into it if they weren't ready, but I knew I couldn't face this alone anymore. There was a pull, a magnetic force drawing me back to that place. Maybe I had to know what it wanted, or maybe I was just desperate to end the torment. Either way, I knew that this time, something was going to break. I had no idea how wrong I was. I drove to the hospital that evening, the light fading quickly as I approached the decaying building. The air was unusually still, not even a breeze to stir the dead leaves that littered the ground. The hospital stood like a giant, looming over me, as if it had grown larger since the last time I saw it. Its dark windows like eyes that were waiting, watching. I didn't hesitate. I parked my car and got out, my legs feeling like lead as I walked toward the entrance. The door creaked open with a familiar, sickening groan, and I stepped inside. The hospital was even darker than I remembered. The once bustling halls were now silent, save for the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The stale air smelled like mildew, mixed with something older, something that didn't belong. As I made my way down the corridor, the temperature seemed to drop with every step, until I could see my breath hanging in the air in front of me. And then I heard it, the faint tapping sound. I froze. It was coming from somewhere deep within the hospital, the same sound I had heard so many times before. It echoed through the halls, each tap growing louder, closer. But this time, there was something different about it. The sound wasn't just random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, as if whatever was making it was trying to communicate, trying to tell me something. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn around and run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the hospital itself was holding me in place, refusing to let me go. I took a step forward, and then another. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence. A presence that was moving toward me, following me. I turned a corner, and that's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim light. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but then I saw it move. It didn't walk, it glided, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. It was tall, thin, and dressed in something that looked like a hospital gown, but the fabric was torn and stained with something I couldn't identify. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me, trying to understand me. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of there. But I didn't. I couldn't. It was as if my body was frozen, rooted to the spot by the force of its gaze. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, drilling into me, probing my very soul. Then it moved. It was so fast, so sudden, that I couldn't react in time. It darted toward me, covering the distance between us in an instant. I felt a coldness, an ice-cold grip wrapping around me, freezing me in place. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. I don't know how long I stood there, trapped in its gaze, but it felt like an eternity. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The tapping stopped. The figure vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but the sound of my own panicked breathing. I didn't stay to investigate. I didn't stay to see if it would come back. I turned and ran, faster than I thought possible, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that it drowned out everything else. I didn't look back until I was outside, gasping for air, my legs trembling beneath me. But the terror didn't end there. As I stood outside, trying to steady myself, I saw something in the corner of my eye movement, and then another shadow, smaller but unmistakably human, darted across the window on the second floor of the hospital. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what I had seen inside that hospital, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't over. Whatever had been haunting us, whatever had been following us from that forsaken place, was still out there, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed what it wanted. I left that night, but the shadows followed me, clinging to my every step, whispering in the back of my mind. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I couldn't. Not yet. But I knew, deep down, that we were all connected now, bound by something darker than any of us could understand. The hospital had its claws in us, and no matter how far we ran, it would never let us go. The days following my encounter at the hospital felt like I was living in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. I kept thinking about that figure, about how it had glided toward me. Its eyes, those eyes that I couldn't see but could feel. It was a presence I couldn't shake, and I knew that no matter how far I ran, it wouldn't let me go. The fear gripped me tighter with each passing hour. The shadow I had seen at the hospital, the figure that seemed to exist just beyond the reach of the light, had made its mark on me. I didn't speak to anyone for a while. Mark hadn't returned my calls, and Sam had stopped responding to my texts. I wanted to reach out, to warn them, but I was afraid that whatever I had encountered in that hospital was already too much for me to bear alone. I didn't know what would happen if I dragged them into it, but it wasn't just me anymore. The others were feeling it too. There was a heavy silence in the air when I finally decided to contact them again. I needed to know if they had experienced anything strange, anything that connected them to that place. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew we couldn't ignore this any longer. I called Mark first. His voice sounded shaky, unlike the calm, collected tone I had been used to hearing. It was obvious that something had happened, something that had shaken him to his core. "I've been having dreams," he said quietly, "about the hospital, about the things we saw." I wasn't sure how to respond. I had been having the same dreams, waking up in cold sweats, my heart racing, the same dark figure standing at the foot of my bed. I felt a cold dread creep into my chest as I realized we were all connected by whatever had been unleashed that night. "I've seen it too," I said. "The shadow. It's following us." There was a long pause before Mark spoke again. "We need to end this. We need to go back. I can't live with this feeling anymore." I didn't hesitate. I knew he was right. We had to confront whatever this was, no matter the cost. We couldn't keep running from it. It had already seeped into our lives, into our thoughts. It was only going to get worse the longer we ignored it. I reached out to Sam, and to my relief, she responded. Her voice was filled with the same fear I had been hearing in my own. "I've been seeing things too," she admitted. "I thought I was going crazy at first, but after everything that happened at the hospital, I can't ignore it anymore." We made a plan. We would return to the hospital together. This time, we wouldn't face it alone. We needed answers, and we needed to end this nightmare before it consumed us completely. The night we returned to the hospital, the air felt thicker, more oppressive. The building seemed to have grown even darker, its broken windows like vacant eyes staring out into the night. As we approached, I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the hospital itself was watching us, waiting for us to enter. We gathered at the entrance, and for a moment, none of us moved. We were all paralyzed by the weight of the decision we had just made. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pounding with every passing second. "Are we sure about this?" Sam asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked at her, at Mark, both of them standing there, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. But there was something else there, too, determination. We had no choice. We had to face this together. "We don't have a choice," I said, trying to sound confident. "We have to end this." The door creaked open, just as it had the first time we stepped inside. The same foul air hit us, and the temperature seemed to drop instantly, making my breath visible in the cold night air. It was silent, too silent, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to make the first move. We ventured deeper into the hospital, each step echoing through the empty halls. The flickering lights above us cast long shadows on the walls, the darkness threatening to swallow us whole. But there was no turning back now. We moved as one, staying close, listening to every creak and groan of the building around us. The tapping sound, that familiar rhythm, seemed to follow us again, but it wasn't the same. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. It was as if it was guiding us, leading us deeper into the heart of the hospital. We reached the corridor where I had encountered the shadow before. The hallway seemed even darker now, as if the darkness itself was growing stronger. I could feel the air pressing in on us, thick and suffocating. We stopped at the same spot, the one where I had seen the figure, but this time I wasn't alone. Mark and Sam stood with me, their faces set in grim determination. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They weren't coming from behind us this time. They were coming from the end of the hall. Slowly, they grew louder, echoing off the walls, growing closer with every passing second. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body felt frozen, as if the hospital itself was holding me in place. "Do you hear that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, barely able to breathe. The footsteps stopped. A cold gust of wind swept through the hallway, blowing the hair back from my face. The temperature dropped even further, and for a moment, I couldn't see anything at all. The darkness was absolute, swallowing us whole. And then it appeared. The figure. It was standing at the far end of the hall, just like before. But this time, there was no mistaking it. I could see its face now, or at least, I thought I could. It was pale, gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black holes, staring into me, through me, into something far deeper than I wanted to know. The air seemed to vibrate with the presence of the figure, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, and another. Each movement was like a slow dance, each step bringing it closer until it was within arm's reach. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch, frozen in place, as the figure reached out its hand toward me. And then, everything went black. I woke up outside the hospital, my body aching, my mind foggy. The others were there too, shaken but alive. We had escaped, but the terror lingered, a dark cloud that refused to lift. We had come so close to finding the answers, but now we were left with more questions than ever. What had that figure been? What had we disturbed in that hospital? And why couldn't we escape it? We didn't have answers. We couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. The hospital was still there, waiting, and whatever had been unleashed inside those walls was far from over. Our lives had changed that night, and no matter where we went, no matter how far we ran, the shadow of the hospital would always follow us. It's been months since we left the hospital, but in a way, I feel like we never really escaped. Every night when I close my eyes, I'm back there, standing in that dark hallway, feeling the figure's eyes on me, watching me, even when I can't see it. We went on with our lives as best as we could, but a part of me knows it isn't over, that something has followed us, something that we may never fully understand. I often wonder if that's just the way these things go, or if the hospital really did open a door that can never be closed again. Mark moved out of town not long after that night. He never said it, but I know why. It wasn't just the fear that lingered in him. It was the feeling of being hunted, the way the darkness seemed to follow him even in broad daylight. He found a new job in another city, and as far as I know, he's been trying to move on, though I doubt he'll ever feel at peace. Sam stayed around for a while longer. We both tried to make sense of what happened, talking about it over and over, trying to make some connection, some piece of evidence that could explain what we saw, what we felt. But the more we talked, the less it seemed to make sense. Every conversation only pulled us deeper into the mystery, and with each new theory, we both knew that nothing we could say would explain what had happened. I started to believe that the truth was beyond us, that some things, some experiences just weren't meant to be understood. I suppose that's what scared me most. The idea that whatever we had encountered in that place wasn't bound by the rules of reality we'd always trusted. It wasn't just a ghost, or a spirit, or some kind of illusion. No, it was something more, a force, a presence, a reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. Over time, I tried to move on too. I focused on my work, started spending more time with my family, but something in me was always unsettled. It wasn't just the memories of the hospital, it was the way the world began to feel different. I started to hear things, distant noises that couldn't be explained, whispers in the corners of rooms, footsteps behind me when I was alone. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like I wasn't alone. I'd turn on the light, but nothing would be there. It was as though the darkness had been permanently etched into my mind. I stopped going to certain places, areas near the hospital, even some that were a little too far out of my usual routine. It wasn't that I consciously avoided them, but every time I went near, I felt the pull, that same coldness, that same oppressive weight. It wasn't a coincidence. I'd like to say that I found peace in all of this, that I resolved whatever lingering terror clung to me, but I didn't. There's no closure when it comes to these kinds of experiences. No neat and tidy answers. The more I think about it, the more I realize that maybe some things should remain unanswered. Maybe some mysteries are too dangerous to uncover, too terrifying to explore. As for Sam, she moved far away, somewhere I couldn't reach her. I haven't heard from her in months, and I wonder often if she's found peace. I like to think she has. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that whatever we encountered together still lingers somewhere in the dark. I've tried to move on, to live a life without constantly looking over my shoulder. I don't talk about it much anymore. Not to people who don't know, but I can't stop thinking about the hospital. That place was more than just an abandoned building. It was a threshold, a boundary between the world we know and something far darker. The shadow that followed us, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, is not something you just shake off. It's always there, just under the surface, waiting for a crack in the fabric of normalcy. Sometimes, in quiet moments, when I'm alone, I can feel it again. That sense of dread creeping up from the edges of my vision, like the darkness has come alive once more. I'll catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, or hear a sound I can't explain. And for a second, I'll think that maybe it's still out there. Maybe it's still watching. I think about the stories people tell, the ones about haunted places, and I wonder how many of them are true. How many others have felt the way we did that night? Maybe what happened to us isn't as unique as I think. Maybe there are more places like the hospital, more doors that shouldn't be open, more shadows waiting in the dark. But as I reflect on it now, I realize one thing. Sometimes it's better not to know, to walk away and leave the past behind. And yet, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully leave it behind. The memories are always there, lurking in the background, just waiting for the right moment to resurface. So I keep moving forward, day by day, and try to live as normal a life as I can. But I know that some things never fully go away. And sometimes, when the night is particularly still, I swear I hear something faint, just a whisper, just a shadow of a sound, and I wonder if it's the past calling me back. I wonder if we ever really escape at all. It was a crisp, clear evening when I moved into the new apartment, the kind of weather that was just chilly enough to justify wearing a jacket, but not so cold that you dreaded stepping outside. It had been a long day of hauling boxes, assembling furniture, and trying to make sense of the unfamiliar layout. This was supposed to be the start of a fresh chapter. I just signed a lease for an apartment in the older section of town, an area that had a strange sort of charm. The buildings here were a bit worn, a bit faded, but each one told a story, one that I could sense even as I stepped across the threshold. The apartment was small but cozy, perfect for someone like me who didn't mind solitude. I was used to living alone, and honestly, I enjoyed the peace it brought. There were no roommates to share space with, no family to crowd the rooms. Just me, my thoughts, and my books. The building was an old brick structure, one of those places that had seen decades of people come and go. The hallways had a faint musty scent, though nothing too overwhelming. The floorboards creaked as you walked, but that didn't bother me. I was used to the little quirks of older buildings. It added character. The neighbors seemed pleasant enough. I'd met a few of them as I moved in, all polite smiles and casual greetings. None of them really stood out, though. Everyone was just living their own life, tucked into their own space. My neighbors lived next door in apartment 3B, though I hadn't seen much of them. In fact, I hadn't heard much from them at all. It was odd, considering the thin walls that made it impossible to not overhear the normal sounds of daily life, doors closing, footsteps, the occasional argument. But apartment 3B was quiet, almost eerily so. I hadn't thought much of it at first. After all, people lead busy lives. They work long hours, go to the store, and spend their nights doing who knows what. I was just settling in, figuring out where everything went, trying to create a routine in this new place. In the evenings, I'd unpack, grab something to eat, and relax in front of the TV. On weekends, I'd explore the neighborhood, grabbing coffee at the small cafe on the corner, or picking up groceries at the local market. The apartment was beginning to feel like home, and I was starting to enjoy the solitude, but there was something about the quiet next door that stuck with me. At night, the silence from 3B was so thick that it felt almost unnatural. I couldn't help but wonder about the people who lived there. Why did they never seem to make a sound? Despite the oddness, life continued on. I settled into a routine, growing more comfortable with each passing day. The faint creaks of the building at night became soothing rather than unsettling. And yet, there was something gnawing at the back of my mind, a feeling that something wasn't quite right. But, as with most things that happen when you move into a new place, I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity, the newness of it all. It was nothing to worry about, but the first strange noise from next door would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening when I first noticed it. The night had fallen, and I had settled into my routine, a quick dinner, a bit of TV, and then some quiet time before heading to bed. It was already past midnight when I heard the sound for the first time, faint but distinct, coming from the apartment next door. At first, I thought it was just the usual noises of an old building, creaks and groans as the walls and floors shifted in the night. But this wasn't like that. It was a soft, tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate. I paused for a moment, my gaze shifting to the wall that separated my living room from the one next door. The tapping continued, steady, almost as if someone was tapping on the wall with their fingers. The strange thing was that the sound didn't stop. It kept going for what felt like an eternity, echoing through the silence of the night. I held my breath, straining to listen, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't a normal sound, not like the typical creaks of an old building settling. This was something different. I got up from the couch, walking toward the wall. The tapping seemed to be coming from the other side, as though someone was just on the other side of the room, playing an endless rhythm against the wall. I pressed my ear against the cold plaster, but the sound stopped as soon as I did. Silence. I stood there for a moment, waiting, but nothing came. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination running wild. Maybe it was just the wind outside, or the sound of pipes settling, or perhaps it was the building itself adjusting to the temperature. I returned to the couch and tried to shake off the odd sensation that lingered in the air. But as I tried to concentrate on the TV, the tapping started again, louder this time. It wasn't just a soft tap. It was insistent, quick, and purposeful. The rhythmic pattern was unmistakable. It felt like someone was intentionally trying to get my attention. I stood up again, this time moving cautiously toward the door to my apartment. My hand hovered over the knob, and I hesitated for a moment. Should I knock on 3B's door? I thought maybe someone had gotten locked out, or perhaps they were just doing something strange inside. But no, if it were something innocent, they'd stop by now. The noise wasn't random anymore. It had a purpose. But I couldn't shake the nagging thought that I was being foolish, making something out of nothing. So I sat back down, trying to focus on the TV, though my thoughts kept drifting back to that unsettling sound. It continued off and on throughout the night. The following days passed in a blur of normalcy. The tapping from next door hadn't repeated in quite the same way, but there were other odd sounds, scraping noises that would pierce the silence of the night. Footsteps that didn't seem to come from the floor above or below, but rather from the wall itself. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing, wondering what on earth was going on next door. But whenever I would venture to the hallway to check, everything appeared completely normal. No one was ever around, and no strange occurrences seemed to take place outside of my apartment. The neighbors, the ones in 3B, remained invisible. I never heard their voices, never saw them come or go. It was as though they didn't even exist. I tried to convince myself that it was just an old building. Old buildings made strange noises, right? The sound of pipes, the shifting of walls, maybe even the wind playing tricks on my ears. But still, the nagging feeling stayed with me. I decided to speak to the building superintendent, just to see if they knew anything. His name was Greg, a man in his late 50s with thick glasses and a rather vacant expression most of the time. He'd been the one to show me the apartment when I first moved in, and he seemed like a typical building superintendent, gruff but efficient. When I mentioned the odd noises, Greg simply shrugged. Old buildings do that. The wood creaks, the pipes settle. It's nothing to worry about, he said. This place has been here for decades, and it's got its quirks. Nothing to be scared of. But his response only unsettled me more. He didn't even blink when I mentioned hearing strange sounds coming from the apartment next door. I pushed a little further, asking if anyone had ever complained about anything unusual happening in 3B. Greg gave me a puzzled look. 3B? He repeated, scratching his chin. I don't think anyone's lived there in a while. That hit me like a ton of bricks. What did he mean? No one had lived there in a while. I could have sworn the apartment had been rented when I moved in. The lease had been signed, but Greg seemed unfazed, as if the idea that no one was living there should have been no big deal. I'll look into it, he added, before walking away with his usual lack of concern. Days went by, and the strange noises continued. At times, it was tapping against the wall. At others, it was a dragging sound, like something heavy being moved, but it was never consistent. Sometimes it would happen late at night. Sometimes it would start as early as the afternoon. I was on edge, constantly aware of the sounds coming from next door, but no matter how hard I tried to investigate, there was never anyone around to ask about it. It was on a Friday evening that things took a more disturbing turn. I had just settled into bed, the apartment dark and quiet, when the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed through the walls. They were slow, methodical, as though someone was pacing back and forth in the apartment next door. My heart started to race. There was something about the sound, something deliberate in the way it moved, as though the person next door knew exactly when I was listening. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed Greg. His voice was groggy when he answered, but he agreed to come by and check the apartment next door. I stood by my door, nervously watching the hallway, waiting for him to arrive. The footsteps from next door grew louder, more pronounced, as though they were moving closer to the wall, separating our apartments. Greg arrived within 10 minutes, but by then, the sounds had stopped. It was almost as if whatever had been pacing next door had vanished into thin air. "Well, looks like it's just you, all alone in here," Greg said, giving me a half smile. "There's no one else in 3B, but I wasn't convinced." There was something unsettling about the silence that followed the stillness, the way everything seemed too quiet. I had a strange feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to turn away, to ignore it. I didn't sleep that night. The days that followed were marked by an increasing sense of unease. The tapping, the footsteps, the dragging noises, they all began to happen more frequently. And each time they did, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer. It wasn't just a random occurrence anymore. It had a rhythm, a pattern, one that seemed designed to get under my skin. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if something truly was wrong. One afternoon, as I was reading on the couch, I heard it again, the tapping. But this time, it was louder, more insistent, as if it were demanding attention. I closed my book, set it down, and listened carefully. The rhythm was strange, almost like a Morse code, a pattern of short, sharp taps followed by long pauses. My pulse quickened. There was no way this was just an old building settling. No pipes could make a sound like that. No wind could create such an exact pattern. I stood up, my feet heavy on the floor, and walked to the door of my apartment. I opened it slowly, not wanting to alert whoever or whatever was on the other side. I hesitated in the hallway, listening for any further sounds. The air in the corridor was cool, the faint scent of dust hanging in the air. I glanced at the door to 3B, but it remained silent. No signs of life, no movement. It was as if nothing was happening at all. My heart was beating faster now. The noise had stopped for the moment, but I could still feel it lingering in the air. It was that same tension, that suffocating weight that I couldn't shake off. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to figure out what was going on in 3B, and I was going to do it tonight. As the evening set in, I prepared myself mentally for what was to come. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the darkness outside seemed to seep into the apartment. I went over every possible scenario in my head, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was just a tenant that I hadn't noticed before, someone with a strange habit, or a noisy pet. But the more I thought about it, the less convinced I became. This felt different. The noises weren't random. They were purposeful. They were meant to be heard. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the door to 3B. My hand hovered over the doorknob, but I stopped just short of turning it. What if someone was inside? What if they were the source of the noises? The thought made my stomach churn. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. I took a deep breath and knocked lightly on the door. No response. I knocked again, a bit louder this time, and waited. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. Just when I thought no one would answer, I heard the sound of footsteps from inside. My heart skipped a beat. Someone was there. I quickly backed away from the door, my eyes scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. But when the door finally creaked open, there was no one there. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. But the apartment was empty. The faint smell of stale air and old furniture hung in the air. The room was untouched, as though no one had lived there for years. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping across the room. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just a dust-covered floor and peeling wallpaper. I stepped back out of the apartment, my pulse pounding in my ears. Something wasn't right. Whoever or whatever was making those noises wasn't coming from inside 3B, it was coming from within the walls themselves. But how? And why? I spent the next few days trying to rationalize everything. Maybe it was just the stress getting to me, the isolation of living alone in a place that had a history I didn't fully understand. But every time I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, the noises would return. And each time, they were a little bit louder, a little bit more intense. One night, after another exhausting round of tapping, I decided to try something new. I stood still, my back pressed against the wall, listening intently. The sound had become almost predictable now. Tap, tap, pause, Tap, tap, pause. I traced the rhythm with my finger, matching it with the tapping coming from the other side of the wall. It was as if the wall itself was speaking to me. The more I focused, the more I felt the tapping coming from all around me. It wasn't just in one spot, it was everywhere, surrounding me like a blanket of noise. I jolted back, panic creeping into my chest. I grabbed my phone and called Greg. His voice was groggy when he answered, but he agreed to come over and take a look. I waited by the door, watching the hallway closely. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was pressing in from all sides. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I wasn't alone. Greg arrived about 20 minutes later, looking annoyed but willing to check things out. I led him into the living room, and we stood there in silence, listening to the faint sounds coming from next door. The tapping, the dragging, the pacing. "I don't hear anything," Greg said flatly. "Maybe it's just the building settling." I shook my head. "No, this isn't normal. There's something wrong with 3B. I've checked it out, it's empty." Greg gave me a skeptical look, but promised to check the apartment again. This time, he left the door slightly ajar as he stepped inside, disappearing from view. I strained my ears, hoping to catch any sound that might give me a clue, but all I heard was silence. For a long moment, nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was muffled, coming from behind the walls, just out of reach of my hearing. I held my breath, straining to listen, but it faded away just as quickly as it had come. Greg returned a few minutes later, his face pale and his expression unreadable. "There's something in there, but I can't explain it," he said quietly. "I don't think you should stay here alone anymore." The words struck me like a slap in the face. Was it really happening? Was there something in the walls, something trying to make contact? Or had I truly lost my mind? The atmosphere in the apartment had changed. The air was thick, oppressive, and the sounds seemed louder now, closer than before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I was being hunted, but what could I do? What was I supposed to do next? The days leading up to that night felt like a pressure cooker, slowly but surely building until I couldn't take it anymore. The noises had reached a crescendo, a constant background hum that seemed to pulse with its own intent. It wasn't just tapping anymore. The sounds had become more visceral scraping, like fingernails running down the walls, or the slow, deliberate dragging of something heavy across the floor. And every night, as the hours stretched into the early morning, the noises came, relentless and inescapable. I couldn't focus on anything else. My work, my meals, even my interactions with people had become distant, as if I were living in a fog. I felt myself slipping into a state of exhaustion, physically drained, mentally spent. I had become a shell of the person I once was. That night, however, something was different. The air felt heavier than usual, as if it was saturated with tension. I had tried everything: earplugs, music, even sleeping pills, but nothing could block out the noises. The tapping, the dragging, it was like a drumbeat that had become my only companion. I was sitting in the dark, staring blankly at the wall opposite me when the noise started again. But this time, it was different. The rhythm was off. There was no longer a pattern, just chaos. The sound of furniture being overturned, the scuffling of footsteps, all blending together in a cacophony of movement. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't the same noise I'd been hearing for weeks. This was something else. I stood up quickly, my feet shaking beneath me. I walked toward the door, my breath quickening. My hands trembled as I reached for the handle, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was happening. I had to see it for myself. The hallway was dark, the shadows stretching out in front of me like fingers reaching for my soul. I couldn't hear anything anymore. The sounds had stopped just like that. Complete silence. But the silence was suffocating, far worse than the noise. I stepped into the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced down toward 3B, my eyes scanning the walls. Everything was still. I don't know what compelled me to do it. Maybe it was the desperation for answers, or maybe it was the growing terror in my gut. But before I could think it through, I walked toward 3B. I had no flashlight this time, only the faint light from my apartment spilling into the hallway. I reached the door, and for a moment, I just stood there, My hand hovered over the doorknob. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I could feel the presence something was on the other side, waiting. But for what? My hand twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room was pitch black. I stepped inside, my shoes tapping lightly on the hardwood floor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just a physical sensation. It was a visceral understanding that something was with me in the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the walls close in around me, tightening like a vice. As I moved further into the apartment, my senses heightened. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the air seemed amplified in the silence. I could barely hear my own breathing, and yet the oppressive weight of the room felt unbearable. Then I saw it, a figure in the far corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, some shadow playing tricks on my mind. But as I blinked and refocused, the figure became clearer. A man tall, gaunt, his face obscured by shadows, standing completely still. His posture was unnaturally rigid, as if he was frozen in place. My heart slammed against my ribs. I took a hesitant step forward, my voice hoarse as I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. I could feel my hands shaking as I reached for the door behind me, ready to bolt. But something stopped me. Something in the figure's stillness held me in place, like a spell. I could sense that it was waiting for me to approach. But why? The silence stretched out, broken only by the sound of my shallow breathing. And then it happened. The figure turned its head slowly, inch by inch, until it faced me completely. Its eyes, if you could even call them eyes, were nothing but hollow sockets, black and empty, staring straight through me. My chest tightened as I gasped for air, the world around me spinning. There was no warmth in the figure's presence, no sense of humanity, only a cold, oppressive void that consumed everything in its path. The room seemed to shift, the walls warping as if they were closing in on me. I stumbled backward, my legs weak beneath me, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It didn't move, but I could feel it reaching for me, its presence pressing in from all sides. The darkness seemed to deepen, swallowing up everything I knew. I could hear my own voice now, rising in panic as I turned to flee. No, no, no. I backed into the wall, unable to escape, my mind racing, struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this a ghost? A hallucination? I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that room any longer. But then the figure spoke. The words weren't clear, more like a low growl that rumbled from deep within its chest. My legs were frozen in place, as if they no longer belonged to me. "Leave!" The word came through the silence like a cold gust of wind, and my body responded before I could even process it. I turned, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted toward the door, the room spinning around me. My chest was tight, the air thick with fear, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had to get out. I reached the door, my hand slamming against the knob as I yanked it open. The moment I stepped out into the hallway, I gasped for air, the cool air brushing against my skin, grounding me in reality. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled away from 3B. Greg was waiting for me at the end of the hallway, his face pale with worry. He had heard me running, but when he saw my expression, his concern deepened. "What happened? What did you see?" I couldn't speak. I couldn't explain it. My mind was reeling, my senses overwhelmed by what I had just witnessed. The image of that figure, those hollow eyes, haunted me in ways I couldn't describe. "Just get me out of here," I managed to whisper. We left the building that night, and I never returned. But even now, years later, I can still feel the weight of those hollow eyes, the suffocating presence that never left me. I don't know what that thing was, but I know one thing for certain: it wasn't human. And that's a truth I'll never be able to forget. The days following that night blurred together in a haze of confusion, fear, and disbelief. I couldn't shake the image of the figure in 3B, its hollow eyes still haunting my mind. No matter how much I tried to distract myself through work, through talking to Greg, I couldn't escape the sense that something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just the figure in the room, but the feeling that it had been watching me long before I ever stepped into that apartment. Greg insisted that we leave the city. He told me I was acting paranoid, but I could see the same terror in his eyes that I felt inside. We had both witnessed something we couldn't explain. It wasn't just the ghostly figure, but the feeling that the building itself was alive in some malevolent way, breathing down our necks, pulling us deeper into its web. We spent the next few days in a daze, trying to piece together the events of that night. Neither of us could explain what had happened in that apartment, and neither of us was eager to go back and find out. Greg had been right to worry about me. Sleep had become an elusive stranger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the apartment was still watching, waiting. It was as if it had followed me, a shadow I couldn't outrun. I packed up everything I could salvage from my old apartment and moved out the very next week. The building was cold and silent, as though it had swallowed up every ounce of life from within its walls. When I told the landlord I was moving out, she didn't ask any questions. Maybe she knew, or maybe she didn't care. I couldn't bring myself to ask. As for Greg, he stayed with me during the transition, helping me pack my things and sort through the remnants of my life in that place. But even his calm demeanor couldn't cover the fact that he too had been affected by the events we had both endured. It was clear that he had his own experiences with whatever haunted that apartment, but like me, he couldn't make sense of it. We didn't speak much in the weeks that followed. I couldn't. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things left unresolved. I tried to talk to him about it a few times, about the figure, the noises, the overwhelming sense of dread, but the words felt hollow, like trying to describe a nightmare that had no clear end. The hardest part, however, was knowing that we would never truly understand what had happened. Had the entity in 3B been a ghost, a demon, or something far worse? Was it tied to the apartment or to the building itself? There were so many unanswered questions, too many things left in the dark. After I moved out, life slowly started to return to some semblance of normalcy. I found a new apartment in a different neighborhood, far from the shadows of the building that had consumed so much of my life. The noises stopped, the cold presence lifted, and I was able to sleep again. But every now and then, in the quiet of the night, I would feel that same weight settle over me. It wasn't constant, but when it came, it was like a cold hand on the back of my neck, pulling me back to that moment. Greg and I kept in touch for a while, but over time, we drifted apart. The shared experience we had wasn't something you could easily talk about or understand without living through it. It became an unspoken bond, a secret that we both carried but never fully confronted. We both moved on with our lives, trying to bury the memory of what had happened in that apartment, trying to outrun the questions we didn't have answers to. But there were nights, late at night, when I would sit in my new apartment and wonder, what if that thing hadn't been a ghost? What if it was something else entirely? And if that was the case, was it still out there, watching, waiting? I never told anyone else about what happened, and I never will, because what happened in that apartment wasn't just some freak accident or a bad dream. It was something real, something I could never fully explain. And though I've moved on, though I've found a new place to live, I'll never truly be free from the terror I experienced. The shadows that lingered in 3B are still with me, just out of reach. I have no answers, no closure, only the lingering feeling that sometimes, in the stillness of the night, something is waiting for me to return. Months passed since I left that cursed building behind, yet there are nights when the air feels heavier, when the shadows in the corners of my room seem to stretch just a little too far. It's as though the things I experienced there have etched themselves into my soul, lingering like a permanent scar, something I can't erase no matter how far I run. It's strange, isn't it? You think you can escape your past, especially a past like mine, full of things you can't explain. You think that if you move far enough away, change enough things, the memories of what you've seen will start to fade. But they don't. They never really do. And every so often, I still hear the faint creak of floorboards in my new apartment, the soft shuffle of footsteps, like someone walking around just out of sight. I'll freeze, heart pounding, as my mind races to make sense of the sound, but I never find anything. The apartment is always empty, just as it should be, but still, that unease remains. I thought leaving the apartment would be the end of it. I thought I could shake off the memories, the fear, and move on with my life. But the truth is, there are some things you never fully leave behind. There are some things that leave a mark on you, things that find their way into the deepest parts of your mind and stay there, lingering just beneath the surface. As much as I tried to bury the past, it had already sunk its claws into me. There was no escaping the reality of what happened in that apartment. I didn't know what that thing was, whether it was a spirit or something darker, but I knew it wasn't done with me. There were moments, especially when I was alone in the dark, when I felt as if it were still watching, waiting. I could feel its cold presence creeping in, just beyond the reach of my senses, like a shadow cast by the dimmest light. I can't explain it. I don't even know if I want to. What I do know is this. Whatever it was that haunted that apartment, it didn't just live in the walls. It wasn't contained to 3B. It had found its way into me, into my mind. And now, no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that it's still with me. In the quiet of the night, as I lie in bed with the weight of exhaustion pulling me into sleep, I can still hear it, those faint footsteps, that subtle creak of the floorboards. They're not real, I tell myself. They're just echoes of the past, memories haunting me in the stillness. But deep down, I know better. It's always there, lurking, waiting for me to remember. I don't know if I'll ever truly get over what happened in that apartment. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my life trying to outrun it, trying to fill my days with enough noise and distractions to drown out the memories. Or maybe, one day, I'll face it again, whatever it is, and find the answers I've been searching for. But until then, I'll keep moving forward, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering when I'll feel those cold, watching eyes once again. I'll keep telling myself that it's just my imagination, that it's just the past creeping in. But deep down, I'll know the truth, that some things never really leave us. It was an ordinary evening, like so many others. The kind where you feel safe and secure in the comforts of your own home. I, like many of you, lived a rather typical life, a regular job, daily routines, a few hobbies here and there. Nothing too exciting. My name's Mike, and this story starts when everything was, well, normal. It was the kind of evening where nothing seemed out of place. The clock ticked steadily on the wall, and the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filled the silence. I was sitting on my couch, flipping through the channels aimlessly, trying to find something to watch. I'd already had dinner, a simple meal of pasta, and was looking forward to just relaxing for the night. My phone sat beside me on the coffee table, face down as it always did when I was watching TV. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I heard an incoming call. The sound of my phone vibrating across the table brought me back to reality. I reached over to grab it, expecting to see a text or maybe a call from a friend. But what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The number on the screen wasn't one I recognized. I don't know why, but something about it felt off. It wasn't from a local area code, but it also didn't seem like it was from anywhere far off. Just unfamiliar. I stared at the screen for a few moments, my thumb hovering over the green call button, then pulling away. I wasn't sure why, but my gut told me something was strange about this call. It wasn't a telemarketer I could usually tell from the area code. This was something different. After a moment's hesitation, I pressed decline and set the phone back down. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just some random caller or a wrong number. But then the call came again, only minutes later. I glanced down at my phone, and once again, there was that same unfamiliar number. This time, I didn't hesitate. I let it ring for a bit longer, then declined it again. What were the odds of 2 calls in quick succession from a number I didn't know? Maybe a mistake, maybe a coincidence. I wasn't too worried, but still, something felt strange. That night, after a while, I fell asleep on the couch, the TV still playing some mindless rerun. But then, in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of my phone ringing again. The same number I didn't pick up. I just let it ring, feeling a rising sense of unease settle in my stomach. This wasn't just a wrong number. This was something else. Something I didn't understand. I turned the phone off, hoping that would stop the calls. But when I woke up the next morning, it was there again, the same strange number, waiting for me on the screen. I had hoped it would end on its own, but it didn't. It was only the beginning. At this point, I should have done something. I should have reported the number or blocked it. But instead, I kept letting it ring every time it came through, just to see what would happen. That's the thing about curiosity. It can be a dangerous thing. The calls didn't stop. Day after day, they came. Sometimes they were spaced out, sometimes a few minutes apart, but every time it was the same number, and every time I declined. The strange, unsettling feeling I had about it only grew with each ring. It wasn't just the calls though. That strange number began to seep into other areas of my life. I would catch myself looking over my shoulder when I walked around the house, the sensation of being watched hanging in the air. I started hearing noises at night, footsteps outside my window, whispers in the distance, always just out of earshot, but close enough to make my skin crawl. As the days passed, the feeling of normalcy began to slip away, piece by piece. The strange number, the unsettling sounds, the weight of that presence, I couldn't shake it. Something was happening, and I couldn't explain it. The unease began to consume me, making it hard to focus on anything else. It was as though my entire life was being overshadowed by this unknown presence, and all I could do was wait for the next call, the next noise, the next strange event. It felt like I was on the edge of something I couldn't control, something I didn't fully understand. But I kept waiting, kept listening, kept wondering. What did it all mean? I had no idea, but by now, I wasn't sure I wanted to find out. It started to get worse, though I couldn't have predicted how much. At first, it was small things, those minor disturbances that you brush off as coincidence or a product of an overactive imagination. But over time, they began to feel less like random events and more like deliberate attempts to intrude on my life. It was a Friday evening when the first truly unsettling event happened. I had just finished a long day at work, and I was more than ready to relax. I'd made a habit of getting home, tossing my bag on the couch, and collapsing into the same chair every evening. That night was no different. The house was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator, and I could feel the tension from the work week start to melt away. I just started watching a movie, something light to take my mind off things. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the television screen. Outside, the night air was cool, and the world seemed to be moving at a steady pace, just as it always did. Then, I heard it again, a noise distinct and out of place. A soft tap at the door, almost as if someone were knocking, but not quite. I wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came by unannounced, especially not on a Friday night. I paused the movie, listening. There it was again, a single tap. I froze, trying to make sense of it. My initial thought was that it was the wind, maybe something from outside branches tapping against the window, or some other natural noise. But the more I listened, the more I realized that it was coming from my front door. I stood up slowly, my heart rate picking up, and made my way to the door. No one was there. I checked the porch, looked through the peephole, and scanned the area around the house. Nothing, just the empty street and the quiet of the night. I couldn't help but feel uneasy. It didn't make sense. I wasn't expecting anyone, and there was no one around. Still, I convinced myself it was probably just a mistake. Perhaps a neighbor had knocked and moved on quickly. I went back inside and sat down, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. I resumed the movie, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a subtle tension in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. The night wore on, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch, leaving the TV on. I woke up a few hours later, groggy and disoriented, with the television still glowing in front of me. That's when I heard it again. The same tap at the door. A light knock, barely audible, but there nonetheless. I jumped to my feet, panic creeping up my spine. My mind raced as I quickly glanced at my phone. No messages, no missed calls. I crept toward the door, this time more cautious, more alert. I peered through the peephole again, but there was nothing. The street outside was as quiet as ever. By this point, I was getting frustrated, even a little scared. I couldn't explain the knocking. It wasn't some prank or a mistake. The timing, the exact sound, it felt deliberate. But why? Who would be doing this? I went back inside and locked the door behind me. The house suddenly felt too big, too empty. I tried to settle my nerves by turning on some lights, hoping the brightness would push away the unease. But as the night wore on, the feeling of something being wrong only deepened. That's when my phone rang again, same number, again. I had been ignoring it for days, but I couldn't anymore. Something about the combination of the strange knocking and the persistent calls made me feel like I was on the edge of something I didn't understand. I hesitated for a moment, then answered the call. My pulse quickened, and I waited for the voice on the other end, but there was only silence. No breathing, no sound at all. Just the faint hum of the line, as if the call was nothing more than an empty void. "Hello?" I said, my voice tentative. Silence. Then, just as I was about to hang up, I heard something barely perceptible, but there. A soft whisper. Too faint to make out, but definitely there. I felt my stomach lurch. My pulse thudded in my ears, and I slammed my finger against the end button, cutting the call. I stared at my phone, wide-eyed. What was that? Who was on the other end? I tried to shake it off, but the feeling of dread had settled deep inside me. Something wasn't right. The tapping at the door, the strange calls, the feeling that someone or something was watching me, it was all too much. Over the next few days, things didn't improve. The calls kept coming, every few hours, sometimes more frequently. Each time I ignored them, but the silence on the other end started to feel like a presence, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I tried to block the number, but it didn't help. The calls still came, from different numbers, always with the same eerie silence. I couldn't ignore the growing fear inside me. I started to stay awake longer at night, listening for any sound, any indication that something was out of place. I checked the locks on my doors several times before bed, each time feeling the creeping sense that I was being watched. It was as if I were being pushed further into a corner, with no escape in sight. And then, something happened that I couldn't explain. One morning, I woke up and found that the front door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it the night before. I checked it multiple times before going to bed, but there it was open, just a crack, as if someone had come inside while I slept. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the door, my heart pounding. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in, but the door was open. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That was when I realized it wasn't just the calls or the knocking. Something else was happening, something far darker than I had imagined, and I had no idea how to stop it. As the days went by, the strange incidents only became more frequent. The knocking continued, the calls persisted, and the sense of being followed, of being trapped in my own home, grew stronger. Every time I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The feeling of being haunted, of something sinister lurking just outside my reach, became a constant in my life. I knew I had to do something, but I couldn't figure out what. I couldn't shake the fear that whatever was happening, whatever was making its presence known, was getting closer, and I had no way to stop it. The days began to blur together, each one feeling more oppressive than the last. It was like living in a fog of dread, where even the smallest moments felt loaded with unease. The knocking at the door continued, a steady rhythm that echoed through the walls of my home. It never came at a predictable time, but it was always there, persistent, relentless. I had stopped answering the phone calls, but they never stopped coming. Different numbers, different times, always silent. It was as if something or someone was trying to communicate, trying to make me feel trapped. The fear became a constant companion. I couldn't escape it, not even in the comfort of my own home. And the knocking, it was no longer just knocking. It became more pronounced, more deliberate. There were nights when I would lie in bed, my mind racing, and I would hear it again. Soft at first, then louder, almost like a knock at the window. But when I checked, the window was always locked, the street outside empty. I began to notice other things. Small details that seemed insignificant at first, but over time, they formed a pattern that I couldn't ignore. My phone, for instance, seemed to be acting up. Calls would drop unexpectedly, messages would disappear, and sometimes the screen would flicker with strange, cryptic numbers that I couldn't make sense of. I chalked it up to a glitch, but it happened too often to be just a coincidence. One evening, as I sat in the living room, the tapping at the door came again. This time, however, it was different. It was faster, more insistent, as though someone was trying to get my attention, desperately. I froze, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. Nothing. The silence felt heavier, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what to do. I had tried ignoring it, hoping it would stop, but it never did. The strange occurrences were becoming more frequent, and my nerves were fraying at the edges. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't sleep without the feeling that someone was watching me. The house was becoming a prison. One night, after a particularly sleepless evening, I decided I had had enough. I was done being a passive observer to these events. I needed to figure out what was happening. It was a decision driven by a mixture of fear and frustration. I couldn't just sit in the dark and wait for things to escalate further. I grabbed my coat and made my way to the front door. The knock came again, almost as if in response to my thoughts. It was a sharp rap, like a finger tapping on the glass. I paused, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hadn't even planned on answering it, but the compulsion to confront whatever was on the other side was overwhelming. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting to find no one there. But there, standing on the doorstep, was an envelope, plain, white, and unmarked. My breath caught in my throat. I picked it up, feeling a strange coldness seep through the paper as I held it. It was heavier than it should have been. My fingers trembled as I tore it open, half expecting to find something horrifying inside. But there was nothing but a single piece of paper with a set of numbers written on it. No name, no message, just numbers. I stared at them, but they didn't make any sense. They were too random, too specific, like some kind of code. I could feel my pulse quicken as I looked around, my mind racing. Who had left this? And why? What did it mean? I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just another strange occurrence, another piece of the puzzle. But it didn't feel like just an odd coincidence anymore. It felt deliberate. Something was trying to communicate with me, but the question was, what? That night, I couldn't sleep. The numbers haunted me. I kept thinking about them, running them through my mind over and over, trying to make sense of them. They didn't appear to be phone numbers or addresses. They didn't correlate to anything I could find online. It was as if they were meant to be part of something larger, something I wasn't seeing. I decided to take matters into my own hands the next day. The phone calls were becoming unbearable. I had to know who was behind them, who had been knocking at my door, who had left that envelope. I began to investigate, although I wasn't sure where to start. I thought about the numbers again and realized there had to be some connection, some significance to them. I spent hours combing through old books, researching cryptic codes and symbols, hoping to find something that could explain it all. But nothing seemed to fit. The more I searched, the more frustrated I became. The answers were just out of reach, like a riddle I couldn't solve. I couldn't help but feel that I was being toyed with, that someone or something was orchestrating this entire ordeal, pushing me further into a corner, making me question my own sanity. The strange occurrences didn't stop. The knocking at the door became louder, more frantic. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once, as though the source of it was shifting, moving with a mind of its own. It wasn't just the knocks anymore. I started to hear other sounds, whispers, faint but clear, as if voices were drifting through the walls. The air in the house felt thick, heavy, and oppressive. I began to feel like I was suffocating under the weight of it all. The atmosphere was charged with tension, like an electric current running through the house. I couldn't escape it. I reached out to a friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in a while. I needed to talk to someone, to voice my fears, to make sense of what was happening. But when I called, the phone went straight to voicemail. I left a message, but I never heard back. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that no one seemed to be around anymore. I hadn't heard from anyone in days, and even when I did reach out, they didn't respond. The isolation was becoming unbearable. The next night, I sat in the dark again, staring at the numbers on the paper, trying to make sense of them. My phone rang once more, a number I didn't recognize. This time, I answered it immediately, the fear that had been building inside me rising to the surface. The line was silent for a moment before the unmistakable voice of a man echoed through the receiver. His voice was low, distorted, but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as he spoke. "You don't understand, do you? You should have left it alone." And just like that, the call ended. My mind raced, my heart pounding in my chest. I was no closer to understanding what was happening, but it felt like I was being drawn deeper into something that I didn't want to be a part of, but couldn't escape. I had to find out who was behind this. I had to know why this was happening. But with every step I took, every moment I spent investigating, the feeling that I was being watched, that I was being hunted, only grew stronger. The knocking, the calls, the whispers, they were all part of a larger, more terrifying puzzle, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I knew one thing for sure now: I couldn't stop. Not until I found out the truth. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind, each one blurring into the next. I could no longer tell where one ended and the next began. The events, the strange occurrences, the phone calls, and the knocks, they were relentless, and they were wearing me down. The air around me felt thick, suffocating, as if every corner of my house was closing in on me, trapping me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't go another day pretending that everything was normal. The phone calls had increased, each one more unsettling than the last. The voices were clearer now, and the words they spoke sent waves of terror through my body. "You're getting closer," the voice had said in the last call. "Closer than you know, but closer to what?" I had no answers, only questions. I had begun to feel like I was losing my grip on reality. Every night, I'd lie awake, the sound of knocking on my door ringing in my ears, the whispers swirling around me. There were moments when I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. Was the knocking real, or was it just my mind playing tricks on me? The phone calls felt like they came from another world, a place beyond comprehension, but they were real. I couldn't deny that anymore. The numbers from the envelope, the ones I had studied endlessly, had become an obsession. I had tried to trace them, but they led nowhere. They were just numbers, cryptic, random, and yet they felt so important. I was on the edge now, barely holding on, but I had to know what they meant. I had to understand. It felt like the key to everything, to the strange happenings that had consumed my life. And then, one night, everything changed. It was late, well past midnight, and I was sitting in the living room, staring at the numbers again. My mind was numb, exhausted from the constant search for answers. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I should have been sleeping, but sleep had become a distant memory. There was no escaping the feeling that something was about to happen. The air was thick, charged with tension. I could feel it, deep in my bones. And then it came, the knock. It was harder this time, more urgent. It echoed through the house, rattling the walls. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The knock had come again, but this time it wasn't just on the door. It felt different. It was all around me. The walls, the windows, the ceiling. The house seemed to be alive, the very structure vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. My breath came in shallow gasps as I made my way to the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something was pulling me forward, forcing me to open that door, to face whatever was waiting for me on the other side. I reached for the doorknob, and just as my fingers brushed against it, the door swung open on its own. I stumbled back, my pulse racing. But there was no one there. The porch was empty, just the quiet hum of the night air. My mind reeled. I had heard it. There was no mistake. The knock had been real. I stepped outside, my heart in my throat, scanning the darkened street. Everything was still. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. It was as if the world had frozen in place. I turned back toward the door, intending to go back inside. But then I saw it, a shadow, lingering just at the edge of the porch. My blood ran cold. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, barely more than a silhouette in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it was there. And it was watching me. I froze, my body paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the shadow. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the figure spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The words were like a jolt of electricity, snapping me out of my stupor. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I reached for the door. But before I could move, the shadow stepped forward, its form shifting, warping. It was no longer just a silhouette. It was something else, something far darker, far more unnatural. The air around me grew colder, and I could feel the temperature drop, a chill seeping into my bones. I turned and ran, my breath coming in frantic gasps, my heart pounding in my ears. But as I reached the door, it slammed shut in front of me, trapping me outside. I pounded on it, screaming for help, but there was no answer. No one was coming. No one could help me. The knocking began again, louder this time, almost deafening. It came from every direction behind me, to the sides, from above. It was as if the house itself had come alive, its walls closing in on me, suffocating me. I could hear the whispering now, clearer than ever before. The voices were all around me, too many to count, each one speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I turned to face the figure, but it was gone. The shadow had disappeared, leaving only the sound of the knocking and the whispers. I was alone, or so it seemed. But then, the phone rang. I reached into my pocket, my hands trembling as I pulled it out. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, just like all the others, but this time it felt different. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I answered the call, my voice shaking as I spoke. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then the voice spoke again, but it was not the voice I had heard before. This voice was darker, colder, more guttural. "You should have stayed away." The line went dead. I stood there in the darkness, the weight of the words sinking in. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. I had no idea what was happening, no idea what I was dealing with. But one thing was clear now. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop, and I wasn't going to be able to escape it. The knocking continued, louder than ever before. The voices echoed in my ears, and I felt a cold hand grip my heart. I didn't know how much longer I could stand this. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and all-consuming. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything stopped. The knocking ceased. The whispers faded away. The air returned to its normal, stagnant weight. I stood there, trembling, my mind racing. Was it over? Had I somehow escaped? But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't over. It had only just begun. The figure, the calls, the knocks, they were just the beginning. There was something far more sinister at play, something that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. And I was now part of it, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. The silence that followed the final call was suffocating. It was as if the entire world had exhaled, holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But there was nothing. No more knocking, no more voices, no more shadows in the corners of my vision. For the first time in days, the house seemed still, unnervingly so. I stood frozen, staring at the door, my pulse thudding in my ears. I don't know how long I stood there, lost in a state of shock, unable to make sense of what had just happened. The fear that had been suffocating me now gave way to confusion. It was like I was caught between two realities, one where everything was fine, and the other where something truly sinister had taken place. But that part of me, the part that was still trying to make sense of it all, couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And then, the phone rang again. I don't know why I picked it up. It was like I was drawn to it, compelled by some force beyond my understanding. My hand reached for the receiver almost of its own accord, my fingers trembling as I held it to my ear. This time, there was no voice on the other end, only a low, steady hum. My heart raced, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the hum stopped, replaced by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a knock, soft at first, then growing louder, each thud echoing through the receiver. I almost dropped the phone in my panic, my thoughts racing, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The knocking. It was coming from within the house. No, it was coming from the phone itself. "Stop," I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. But the knocking continued, relentless, mocking. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking violently as I stumbled back. My mind was reeling, spinning out of control, trying to grasp onto something, anything that made sense. I had to get out. I had to leave. But where could I go? What could I do? The house felt like a prison. The walls felt alive, like they were closing in around me, suffocating me. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and bolted out the door, running blindly into the night. The cool air hit me like a slap, sharp and biting, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I needed distance. I needed space. I needed to get away from whatever it was that had been haunting me. I ran down the street, not looking back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was a blur, and every sound in the night seemed to send me into a frenzy. The wind howled through the trees. The streetlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. As I reached the end of the street, I slowed down, my chest heaving with exhaustion. I turned to look back toward my house, half expecting to see anything waiting for me in the darkness. But there was nothing. Just the empty street, the silence of the night. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. What had I just escaped? Had I truly escaped it? Or was it just waiting for me to come back? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. I continued walking, my mind still racing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had been happening in that house was done, that I was free. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was wrong. Something told me that the worst was yet to come. The next few days were a blur. I stayed with a friend, unable to return to my own home, and tried to get some rest. But sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadow, the voice, the knocking. It was as if the events had carved themselves into my mind, leaving a permanent mark that I couldn't erase. I called the police, hoping for some kind of explanation, but they were as clueless as I was. They searched the house, but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no explanation for the strange noises or the phone calls. They chalked it up to a prank, an elaborate, unsettling prank, but I knew better. It wasn't a prank. Not in the way they thought. This was something different. I tried to go back to my life, tried to pick up the pieces, but it felt impossible. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching, still waiting. The phone calls stopped, but the knocks continued. Every night, at exactly 2 a.m., I would hear the sound of a soft knock at my door. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was there, a constant reminder that whatever had happened wasn't finished. I did what I could to move on, but deep down, I knew that I wasn't the same person anymore. The fear, the uncertainty, it had changed me. It had broken something inside of me that I couldn't fix. I moved away, left the house behind, and tried to start fresh. I found a new place in a different town, and for a while, it seemed like things were normal again. The knocking stopped, the phone calls stopped, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe it was all just some twisted nightmare I had imagined. Maybe I had just been under too much stress. Maybe it had all been in my head. But one night, about a year after everything had started, I was sitting in my new apartment, staring out the window, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I picked it up anyway. A voice on the other end, low and familiar, spoke 3 words that sent a chill down my spine. "You're not safe." The line went dead. I don't know what's going to happen next. I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. All I can do now is wait, hope, and wonder if the knock will come again. Because I know that when it does, I won't be able to run anymore. The fear has never left me. The days have turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. But the feeling of dread that settled in my chest the moment I received that call has not subsided. I'd like to tell you that I found peace or some sort of resolution, but that would be a lie. In fact, every day that passes only makes me more certain of one thing. This is not something that can simply be shaken off. I moved into this new apartment thinking that the nightmare was over. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter. I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was all some kind of stress-induced delusion. But the phone call, that chilling whisper, "You're not safe," was a reminder that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun the past. It's like a shadow that follows. No matter how fast you run, or how far you go. It always finds its way back to you. Since that call, I've been hyper-vigilant. I don't trust my phone anymore. I don't trust anyone who knocks on my door. I sleep with one eye open, listening for the faintest sound in the middle of the night. The other day, while walking home from work, I saw a man standing across the street. He was just standing there, watching. I turned to glance back after I passed him, and he was gone. The sudden realization hit me like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I've stopped talking about it. No one wants to hear about the strange phone calls, the knocks that never stop. I went to a therapist once, hoping they could explain what I was experiencing. But when I tried to describe the events, the fear in my voice, they looked at me like I was crazy. Maybe I am. Maybe I finally lost my grip on reality. But there's a small part of me that knows this is real. There's something out there, something that won't stop until it's finished. I've made peace with the idea that I may never truly understand what's happening. I don't know if it's some kind of supernatural entity, or if my mind has simply cracked under the pressure. I don't know if anyone will ever believe me, and frankly, at this point, it doesn't matter. I live in a state of constant awareness, a perpetual feeling that something isn't quite right. Some nights, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sound of knocking. It hasn't come in weeks, but I know it's only a matter of time. I can feel it in my bones, the way the air changes when something is near, the way the hairs on the back of my neck stand up before the first knock even echoes through the house. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever escape it. If anyone who has ever lived through something like this can, maybe the only way to truly be free is to accept that I'm not meant to be, that whatever it is that's chasing me won't stop until it gets what it wants. Or maybe there's no purpose at all, just the slow unraveling of sanity, piece by piece, until you're left with nothing but the hollow ache of fear. But in the quiet moments, when I'm sitting alone in my apartment, I can't help but think about what it all means. What it means to be hunted by something that exists beyond our understanding. What it means to live in fear of something we can't explain. Is it simply the human condition? Are we all just waiting for that knock, that call, that thing that will finally pull us into the unknown? I don't know. What I do know is this. No matter how much time passes, no matter how many times I move, or how many doors I close, I will never feel truly safe again. There will always be that lingering thought in the back of my mind. That question, that uncertainty, will it come for me tonight? Will it knock? Will the phone ring again? And will I hear that voice that will remind me that I'm never really free? I don't know, but I feel it. Every night, when the wind howls through the trees, when the shadows stretch across the floor, I feel it. It's waiting, and it's never really gone, and neither am I. So, if you're reading this, know this. We're all just a phone call away from our worst nightmare. We may not know when it will come, or why it will come, but one thing is certain: it will come. And when it does, it won't be the last time. It will never be the last time. And when that knock comes, just remember, it's not a game anymore. It's something that will follow you. It will haunt you until it's finished, until it's done. It was a weekend getaway, something simple and ordinary, something many of us crave to escape the daily grind. I, along with a few friends, had booked a stay at a small, somewhat secluded hotel nestled in the woods just outside of town. It was one of those places that had been around for decades, but was tucked away enough to not draw the typical tourist crowd. The kind of hotel that's seen better days, but still holds a certain charm, even if it was starting to show signs of age. It wasn't fancy. In fact, it was downright outdated, but that was part of its appeal. For a group of friends looking for an easy, inexpensive retreat, it seemed like the perfect spot. The place was called Oakwood Lodge, a name that sounded too quaint to be anything but pleasant. It had a rustic feel to it, surrounded by thick trees that added to the sense of isolation. The front desk was run by a middle-aged man with a friendly smile, who handed us the room keys with a bit too much enthusiasm, as though this was the greatest place to be on earth. I remember thinking, yeah, this is going to be a quiet, relaxing weekend. We made our way to our rooms, 4 of us total. There was Ben, who was more the easygoing type, and Mark, a bit of a skeptic, but always up for an adventure. Then there was Rachel, the more cautious one, and of course me, the one always looking for a story. We weren't exactly strangers to odd experiences. We had all spent enough time in hotels, on trips, or during group vacations to know that strange things can happen in the most ordinary places. But what we didn't know was that Oakwood Lodge had its own stories to tell, stories that no one had ever mentioned, at least not openly. The rooms were basic, furnished with worn furniture that hadn't changed much over the years. The wallpaper was faded, and the carpeting had seen better days, but everything seemed clean enough. There was a lingering scent in the air, a mixture of old wood and something I couldn't quite place, like the smell of dust that had been pushed into every corner of the place. We spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking, and then gathering in the small lounge area by the lobby. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the lodge's old exterior. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost serene, and it seemed like we had the whole place to ourselves. The only other people we saw were a few guests who had passed through the lobby, but they were in and out so quickly it was hard to gauge whether they were staying or just passing by. As evening settled in, we decided to grab dinner at the local diner just a few miles away. The drive was quiet, and the roads were deserted. The only sound was the hum of the engine as we made our way back to the hotel. There wasn't much to talk about. The conversation was light work, life, plans for the future. It felt like a regular trip, one that didn't hint at anything unusual. But little did we know that was about to change. That night, when we returned to the hotel, the air had shifted. The kind of shift that you can't put your finger on right away, but feel deep in your bones. We returned to the rooms, said our goodnights, and retreated to our respective beds. It was a little past midnight when it started. The sound faint at first, like the echo of footsteps down a long hallway. We were all in our rooms, separated by thin walls, and none of us were really awake when it first happened. I remember lying there, half asleep, when I heard a slow, deliberate tap on the door. At first, I thought it was just the winds or maybe some other guest coming back late. But then there was another tap, and another. I lay there, frozen, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't just a knock, it was rhythmic, almost like someone was testing the door. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone was drunk, or maybe it was the sound of the building settling, an odd creak or shift of old wood. I wasn't sure, but something about it felt off. I didn't move at first, too cautious to get up and investigate. But then I heard the same sound again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was louder. And then, it stopped. My heart was pounding in my chest as I debated whether I should get up and check. But before I could make a decision, I heard the faint sound of someone moving down the hallway. The soft shuffle of feet against the worn carpet. I shook my head, trying to push the unsettling thoughts aside. It was probably just someone else staying here, lost in the quiet of the night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to fall asleep, but the noise kept echoing in my head. The next morning, I didn't mention it to anyone. I figured it was nothing, just a weird coincidence, maybe the wind, or maybe even one of the other guests playing a prank. But as we gathered downstairs for breakfast, I noticed something strange. Mark was quiet. He wasn't the type to stay silent for long, and he was usually the first to crack a joke or share a funny story. But that morning, he was off. "You guys hear anything last night?" I asked casually, trying to gauge if anyone had experienced anything unusual. Rachel nodded. "Yeah, I thought I heard something. I didn't think much of it though. I figured it was just the hotel making noise." Ben, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "You guys are probably just hearing things. This place is old. Old places make noises." But I could tell that something was bothering him too. As we finished breakfast, I tried to brush it off, but deep down, I couldn't help but feel that something wasn't right with Oakwood Lodge. Something was lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for us to acknowledge it. The air felt heavier, the shadows seemed darker, and the old wood creaked in ways that didn't feel normal. But we stayed. We weren't going to leave just because of some strange noises. After all, it was just an old hotel, right? Little did we know, the sounds weren't the only strange thing waiting for us. The morning after the strange knocks echoed through the hallway, we carried on as if nothing had happened. The incident seemed so small, almost too insignificant to mention again. It was easy to chalk it up to our minds playing tricks or the building's age causing odd sounds. But deep down, something felt different. There was an unease that lingered, an odd weight in the air, and though we all tried to shake it off, none of us could quite dismiss the feeling that something was off. We spent the day exploring the area around the hotel. Oakwood Lodge was surrounded by acres of forest, with winding trails and small streams that led through the thick trees. It was beautiful, the kind of landscape that made you feel like time had stopped. We walked for hours, our voices echoing through the woods, laughing and joking as we took in the serene surroundings. But as the sun began to set, the sense of unease started to creep back. That evening, after we returned to the lodge, we had dinner in the small dining area that was tucked away in one corner of the hotel. The food wasn't anything spectacular, just basic diner fare, but it was enough. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying tension we couldn't ignore. No one mentioned the knocking sound from the night before, but we all knew it was still in the back of our minds. We tried to push it aside, thinking maybe we were just being paranoid. But there was something in the way the others looked at each other that spoke volumes. As we finished our meal, we decided to head back to our rooms. The night was calm, and the moonlight filtered softly through the trees. The hotel was quiet, except for the faint hum of the old heating system and the creaking of floorboards beneath our feet. We all parted ways, heading to our respective rooms, not speaking much, just moving with that same strange, quiet unease. I had just settled into bed when I heard it again. A soft tap on my door. My heart stopped. It was the same rhythmic tapping from the night before, but this time it was even softer, almost like a whisper against the wood. I froze, listening intently, my mind racing. Could it be a prank? Was someone outside messing with us? Or was it something else? The tapping stopped suddenly, and for a moment, everything was still. I thought about getting up, checking the hallway, but something held me back. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, pressing in. I told myself it was nothing, just another odd sound. But then I heard it again. The shuffling of feet, this time from the hallway. I couldn't stay still any longer. I threw the covers back and stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. The hallway light flickered through the crack under my door, casting a dim glow. Slowly, I moved toward it, my hand hovering over the doorknob, uncertain. Just as I was about to open the door, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but clear enough that I could make out the words. "Help me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The voice sounded close, like it was right outside my door. I stood there frozen, trying to convince myself it was just someone playing a prank. But who would be out there at this hour, whispering those words? It didn't make sense. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, listening for any more sounds. But there was nothing. The shuffling stopped, and the voice had gone silent. I hesitated, unsure whether I should open the door or stay inside. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to peek through the peephole, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no one there. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the hallway. The air felt thick, colder than before, and the darkness seemed to stretch out farther than it should have. The hallway was empty. No sign of anyone. Just the faint echo of the building's old bones creaking under the weight of the silence. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe I had just heard the wind or the building shifting again. But the voice, it was so real. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been right there, just out of sight. And the tapping, too, why was it so rhythmic? It didn't feel accidental. I stepped back into my room and locked the door behind me, not knowing what to do. I lay in bed, my mind racing, trying to find an explanation. But every thought seemed to spiral back to the same conclusion. Something wasn't right about this place. The next morning, I didn't bring it up to the others. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but as we sat down for breakfast, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had felt the shift in the atmosphere. Mark seemed tense, almost jumpy, and Rachel kept glancing around the room, as if expecting someone or something to appear. Ben was the first to speak. "You guys ever get the feeling this place is just off?" he asked, his voice low. I mean, I don't know. It's probably just me, but I swear I keep hearing weird noises at night. Rachel nodded, her face pale. Yeah, I thought I heard something too, like footsteps, but nobody was there. I looked at them, my mind racing. I wasn't the only one who had noticed the strange things. Ben and Rachel had heard it too, but none of us could pinpoint what it was. It wasn't just the sounds, it was the way the hotel felt, the way it seemed to close in around us, like it was watching us, waiting. Maybe it's just the old building settling, Mark said, trying to sound casual, but I could tell he didn't believe his own words. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all missing something important. We decided to explore the hotel a bit more, to try and get a better sense of the place. The lobby, though quaint, had an eerie stillness to it, as if it had been abandoned for years. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes following us wherever we went. The air smelled faintly of must and wood, but there was something else too, a faint, metallic scent that I couldn't identify. We wandered through the halls, our footsteps echoing off the wooden floors, the sound amplified in the silence. As we passed one of the guest rooms, I stopped. I don't know why, I just felt drawn to it. The door was slightly ajar, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move inside. A shadow, maybe, or a figure standing near the window. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. Just an empty room. I turned to the others. Did you see that? Mark shrugged. It's just an old hotel. You're probably just seeing things. But I wasn't sure. The strange feeling was growing stronger now, like we were walking through something we couldn't fully understand. The building seemed alive, in a way, watching, waiting for us to figure it out, or maybe to make a mistake. That night, as we sat in the lounge, trying to relax, the feeling only intensified. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier, and the hotel itself seemed to groan under the weight of its age. Every time I looked toward the hallway, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. We laughed nervously, trying to make light of it. But deep down, we all knew something was off. Something was watching. And then, as we sat there, a door slammed somewhere in the distance. Not a gentle creak or a soft close. This was a forceful bang, loud enough to shake the walls. We all jumped, and for the first time, we looked at each other, wide-eyed and unsure. That was when we knew we weren't alone. The days blurred together, each one heavier than the last, as strange things began happening more frequently. At first, the oddities were subtle, a flickering light here, a door left open when we were sure it had been shut. But over time, the incidents became more unsettling. We could no longer ignore them. We weren't just imagining things anymore. Something was happening in Oakwood Lodge, something that none of us could explain. It started with the sounds. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear scratching noises coming from behind the walls, like someone or something was trying to claw its way out. It wasn't a soft sound either. It was sharp, deliberate, like a desperate attempt to break free. I'd lie in bed, frozen, listening to the noises for what felt like hours, wondering if anyone else could hear it. But when I checked, everyone was still asleep, their breaths even, unaware. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was causing these noises, or I'd lose my mind. I crept out of bed, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped into the hallway. The air was thick, cold, and smelled faintly of mildew, like the hotel had absorbed years of decay and trapped it inside its walls. I could hear my own breath, loud in my ears, as I moved through the darkness. The hallway stretched out before me, its walls lined with portraits that seemed to watch me as I walked. The flickering lights only made it worse. Each time the light blinked out, I felt like the shadows crept closer, pressing in on me. I approached the source of the scratching sound, a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, just like the night we had walked by earlier. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't turn back now. Something inside me, something primal, drove me forward. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning under my touch. The room was empty, save for a few scattered pieces of old furniture covered in dust. But the air inside was heavy, oppressive, as though it had been sealed off for years. It was the same metallic smell I had noticed before, but stronger. There was a faint, musty odor as well, like something rotting in the walls. As I stepped further into the room, I noticed the windows were sealed shut, their curtains drawn tight. No light from the outside made its way in. It was as though the room existed in its own space, a place where time itself had forgotten to pass. I took a few cautious steps deeper, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and then I saw it on the far wall, a set of strange markings scratched into the wood. They weren't random, they were deliberate. Symbols, jagged and uneven, etched deeply into the surface. I reached out, my hand trembling, and traced the lines with my finger. They were cold to the touch, but the strange sensation of being watched never left. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like the room was alive, aware of my presence. Just as I was about to step back, I heard a sound so faint I almost missed it, a low moan, coming from somewhere deep within the room, or perhaps beneath the floorboards. It wasn't a human sound, but something older, something primal. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the ground, as though the room had a hold on me, unwilling to let me go. I turned quickly, snapping myself out of the trance, and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My breathing was ragged as I ran back to my room, but the sounds, the moaning, the scratching still lingered in my ears. The next morning, when I met up with the others at breakfast, I could see the same tension in their faces. None of us had spoken about what we had experienced the night before, but we all knew. We could all feel it, the growing sense of dread that had settled over Oakwood Lodge. Ben was the first to break the silence. Has anyone else been hearing those noises? The scratching and the other stuff? His voice was low, hesitant, as if he was afraid to speak the words aloud. Rachel nodded, her eyes wide. I thought I was going crazy. I heard it too at first. I thought it was just the building, you know? But now it feels different. Like something is trying to get out. We all exchanged uneasy glances. There was no denying it anymore. The hotel was no longer just an old, rundown place. It was something more. Something that was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake, to slip up. I'm telling you, we need to leave, Mark said, his voice sharp with frustration. This place is cursed, or haunted, or whatever. It's not safe here, but none of us were ready to leave. There was something that kept pulling us back, something that made us feel like we needed to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The more we talked, the more we realized that none of us had been imagining it. The noises, the cold air, the strange marks on the walls, they were all real. And if they were real, that meant something was happening in Oakwood Lodge. Something far worse than any of us had considered. Later that afternoon, we decided to explore the hotel more thoroughly. We weren't sure what we were looking for, but we knew we had to try to understand what was going on. The place was enormous, with countless rooms and hallways that seemed to twist and turn in ways that didn't make sense. It felt as though the building itself was alive, a maze designed to trap us in its grip. As we walked through the hallways, we noticed more and more strange occurrences. The lights flickered constantly, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift when we weren't looking. The air grew colder, and the strange metallic smell intensified. It wasn't just coming from the rooms anymore, it was in the walls, in the very fabric of the building itself. We came to a door that was different from the others. It was old, worn, and had a large, rusted keyhole, but no doorknob. It looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. The air around it felt thick, almost as though it were holding its breath. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something's behind this door, Rachel said quietly, her voice trembling. Something we're not supposed to find. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise at her words. Whatever was behind that door, it wasn't something we were ready for. But the feeling that we were being drawn toward it, like moths to a flame, was undeniable. We spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out how to open the door, but it remained locked tight, as if it were keeping its secrets buried deep within. The more we tried, the more we realized that whatever lay behind it was not something we were meant to discover, not yet. As night fell and we retreated to our rooms, the weight of the day hung heavily on us. We could hear the wind picking up outside, howling through the trees, and the occasional crash of thunder in the distance. The atmosphere in the hotel had grown even more oppressive, the air thick with an almost tangible tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt like it was a warning. I lay in bed that night, the sounds of the storm outside mingling with the strange creaks and groans of the hotel. The scratching noises had returned, louder this time. They were coming from all directions, above, below, and within the walls. The moaning was there too, distant but unmistakable. It was as though the building itself was alive, and it was trying to communicate with us. I wanted to scream, to run, to get out of that place before whatever was coming for us finally arrived. But I couldn't. There was something about Oakwood Lodge that kept us there, no matter how hard we tried to leave. Something dark and insistent, like it was never going to let us go. And then, in the dead of night, we heard a loud crash, followed by the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving down the hallway outside my door. This time, I didn't wait. I knew something was out there. And whatever it wasn't friendly. The crash had shattered the silence of the night. The sharp sound of something heavy falling to the floor, followed by a moment of eerie stillness. I felt my heart hammering in my chest, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck as I lay frozen in my bed. The air in the room felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and the scratching noises from earlier now seemed louder, almost deafening. I wasn't alone in my fear. As the heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, I could hear my friends stirring in their rooms as well. Mark's voice broke the silence, low and urgent. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. I had no idea what it was, but one thing was certain. It wasn't a coincidence. Whatever had been haunting us, tormenting us, for days had now made its presence known in the most terrifying way possible. I forced myself to move, pushing the covers off my body and standing up. I had to know what was happening. We had been waiting for something, some sign, some moment when the hotel would reveal its dark secret. But none of us were ready for this. Stay close, I whispered to Mark, who had stepped into the hallway, his face pale and tense. We both started down the corridor, our footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The flickering lights above us cast strange, unnatural shadows, dancing along the walls like specters. Every corner we turned, every door we passed, seemed to whisper of something terrible waiting to be uncovered. The footsteps we had heard earlier had stopped, but we could still feel the presence of something watching us, waiting. As we reached the end of the hallway, the door we had tried to open earlier, the one without a doorknob, with the rusted keyhole, was now standing ajar. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that had caused the crash, but the door itself. The room it led to was no longer locked, no longer keeping its secrets. I glanced at Mark, who looked as terrified as I felt. "We have to go in," I said, my voice barely a whisper. We both knew it was inevitable. We had reached the point of no return. Whatever waited for us behind that door was the culmination of everything we had witnessed so far, the scratching, the moaning, the eerie silence that haunted us at night. We had to face it. We stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us with a force that made us both jump. The room was dark, save for a dim light coming from an old lamp in the corner. The air was suffocating, heavy with the smell of decay. I felt like I couldn't breathe, as though something was closing in around me, trapping me in the room with no escape. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a figure standing in the far corner of the room. It was tall, its features hidden in shadow, but I could feel its presence. It wasn't human. I could sense it, something ancient and malevolent. My skin prickled with a cold fear I had never experienced before. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. Mark took a step forward, his voice shaking as he called out, "Who's there? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but I saw its eyes, or what I thought were eyes, glowing in the darkness. They were deep, empty pits, staring into me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. I couldn't tear my gaze away. I was paralyzed. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided across the room, faster than humanly possible. My pulse raced as I backed away, bumping into the wall behind me. My breath was coming in shallow gasps, my body trembling. The figure stopped in front of us, and I could feel its presence so strongly that it felt like it was inside my chest, suffocating me. "You shouldn't have come here," a voice whispered, but it wasn't from the figure. It came from everywhere and nowhere, an echo that reverberated through my skull. It wasn't a human voice. It was something darker, more sinister. Mark let out a strangled cry, stumbling backward. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely audible. But before either of us could make a move, the room shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath us groaning as if the building itself was alive, twisting, suffocating. I heard the moaning again, louder this time, coming from all directions. The figure's form began to distort, its shape flickering between solid and shadow. It reached out for us, its hands long and twisted, fingers elongated like claws. I felt the temperature drop to freezing, the cold so intense it burned. I grabbed Mark's arm, pulling him toward the door, but it wouldn't open. No matter how hard I pulled on the handle, it was stuck sealed shut by some unseen force. We were trapped. "Why are you here?" The voice asked again, its tone colder now, filled with malice. We didn't mean any harm," I stammered, my voice trembling. I didn't know what I was saying anymore. I couldn't think. I was terrified. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I couldn't breathe. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, its hands closing around my throat. Its fingers were like ice, sending a shock of cold through my entire body. I gasped for air, but none came. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the silence of the room. Mark screamed my name, his voice full of panic, but it felt so far away, like I was sinking into some abyss. My vision blurred as the pressure on my throat intensified. The darkness around me began to close in, and I thought I was going to die in that cursed room. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. The figure released me, stepping back into the shadows. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, my throat burning, my body racked with spasms. The door burst open, and Ben, Rachel, and the others rushed in, their faces filled with shock and horror. I could see the fear in their eyes as they looked at the room, at the figure that was now gone. The air in the room seemed to shift, the temperature returning to normal, as though the darkness had lifted. "What the hell just happened?" Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I managed to say, my voice hoarse. "But we need to leave. Now." None of us said another word as we stumbled out of the room, our bodies still trembling, our minds struggling to process what had just occurred. The hotel was no longer just a place, it was a prison, a nightmare that had come to life. We had been so close to uncovering the truth, but what we had found was more terrifying than we could have imagined. We didn't speak about what happened again. We didn't need to. We all felt it, the weight of what had been unleashed, the knowledge that Oakwood Lodge was a place of darkness, a place that would never let us go. The hallway seemed longer than before, and the once familiar doors, which had led to our rooms, now appeared as though they were miles away. The air in Oakwood Lodge had shifted, thickened, as if every inch of space was steeped in the dread of the night's events. My skin still crawled from the touch of that thing, whatever it was, that had almost killed me, and the others weren't faring much better. "Do you think it's over?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. Her eyes were wide, flickering toward every shadow, every creak in the floorboards, as if expecting something to leap out of the walls at any second. I didn't know what to tell her. In truth, I wasn't sure if it was over. The thing we'd encountered in that room had been so monstrous, so beyond anything we could have comprehended, that I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't done with us yet. We had barely escaped. The terror wasn't something that could simply be shrugged off. "We can't stay here," Mark muttered, his voice sharp with panic. He sounded different, more frantic than I'd ever heard him before. His usual bravado had completely evaporated, leaving only raw, unfiltered fear behind. "We need to leave. Right now." His words hit me with an urgency I hadn't felt before. We had been trying to make sense of this place, exploring it, hoping for an explanation. But now, after what we had seen, all that mattered was survival. The cold grip of the entity's hand still burned on my neck, the terrifying stillness of that figure's eyes replaying in my mind. I couldn't bear the thought of another minute in this hotel. I turned to the others. "We need to go. The car's parked outside. We're getting out of here." Ben and Rachel nodded quickly, their faces pale, eyes haunted. They were done with Oakwood Lodge, done with its shadowed halls and twisted rooms. We all were. Without another word, we sprinted toward the exit. The hotel, once grand and imposing, now felt like a monstrous labyrinth, with every corner concealing a threat. Each step I took made the walls feel closer, the building closing in on us like a living thing, unwilling to let us go. But as we neared the lobby, the first real sign of hope appeared. The front doors, which had been locked earlier, were now wide open. The wind howled outside, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness inside. It was almost as if the hotel was giving us permission to leave, though I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than that. Oakwood Lodge had been alive, breathing with a terrible secret, and now we were walking away from it. Or were we? The sound of footsteps echoed from behind us, a soft, distant thud. My heart skipped, my muscles tensed, and I turned back toward the hallway. Nothing. The corridor was empty. There were no lights, no voices, just the ominous silence of the lodge. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the sound as my own fear getting the better of me. We hurried out into the cold night air, the sharp breeze cutting through my clothes. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the parking lot. But just as we reached the car, ready to flee the nightmare that had been Oakwood Lodge, I heard it again, louder this time. The sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing behind us. I spun around, but all I saw was the empty parking lot, bathed in moonlight. "What is it?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. I didn't know. I had no explanation. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the unmistakable feeling of being watched crept over me. We weren't alone. Ben's hand was already on the door handle, ready to drive away. "We can't wait. We need to get out of here now." I nodded, feeling the same desperate urgency. We piled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. The engine roared to life, and the headlights cut through the darkness as we sped down the long, winding driveway. My hands gripped the seat, my breath coming in short bursts. We were finally leaving, finally escaping. But just as the lodge faded from view in the rearview mirror, a cold chill washed over me. My throat tightened, and the air in the car seemed to thicken. I glanced out the window, half expecting to see anything lurking in the dark. "Did you feel that?" Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with fear. I nodded, though I couldn't explain what I felt. It was as if the hotel was still with us, its presence lingering like a dark shadow that wouldn't let go. It was almost as if we had left a part of ourselves behind, something essential, something that could never be fully freed from Oakwood Lodge. The drive felt endless. Every mile that passed, I thought I could breathe a little easier, but every glance in the rearview mirror made my heart pound in my chest. Was I imagining things? Was I just so rattled by what had happened that my mind was playing tricks on me? Or was Oakwood Lodge still following us, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again? It wasn't until we reached the town and the familiar lights of civilization that the weight lifted. The oppressive atmosphere that had clung to us seemed to dissipate. The shadows seemed less threatening, the air less suffocating. And yet, there was still that unease, that nagging feeling that something was unfinished, that the terror wasn't over. We didn't speak much after that. Words seemed inadequate, and none of us could quite shake the weight of what had happened. How do you explain an encounter with something so dark, so otherworldly? We had faced it head on, and yet we couldn't make sense of it. As I sat in the car, my thoughts racing, I found myself reflecting on the hotel, on its history. We had learned about the strange events that had plagued Oakwood Lodge, the disappearances, the rumors of restless spirits, and the lingering dark energy. But in the end, we had never uncovered the true source of the malevolent force. We had run. We had escaped. But had we truly left Oakwood Lodge behind? Or had it followed us, waiting for the right moment to come back? There were no answers, just a cold, uneasy silence that hung between us, heavy with unspoken fears. In the end, we didn't return to Oakwood Lodge. We never spoke of it again, at least not to each other. The truth of what we had experienced seemed too vast, too terrifying to put into words. We had come to Oakwood Lodge for a weekend getaway, and we had left with more questions than answers. The hotel had never revealed its full secret, only a glimpse of its dark power, a glimpse that would haunt us forever. None of us knew if Oakwood Lodge would claim more victims, or if it was finally done with us. But as I looked out the window and saw the familiar skyline of the town on the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had lived in that hotel was far from finished with us. The road stretched out in front of us, a long, empty path under the cold, indifferent sky. The town we were heading towards seemed so normal, so safe. But deep down, I knew that the terror we had left behind wasn't something that could be easily outrun. There were no words left to say between us, none that could make sense of what had happened. We had all seen it. We had all felt it. And now, we would carry it with us forever. As the car sped further into the night, I couldn't help but wonder if we had really escaped Oakwood Lodge at all. The lodge was no longer visible in the rearview mirror, but something still lingered, a chill in the air that refused to go away, a weight in my chest that felt heavier with every mile. I wasn't sure if it was the place itself, or the feeling of having experienced something so profound that it couldn't simply be erased with distance. There was no closure. The sinister force we had encountered, whatever it was, had not revealed itself fully. It had shown us just enough to make us afraid, to make us question our very perception of reality. And yet, it hadn't been satisfied with scaring us. There was something more to it, something darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped its reach. The others were silent, lost in their own thoughts. Rachel kept glancing out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her face pale. Ben's jaw was set tight, his grip on the steering wheel so firm his knuckles had turned white. Mark was still shaking, his eyes darting nervously to every dark corner of the road. We were all thinking the same thing, but no one had the courage to say it aloud. Would it ever be over? Had we truly left Oakwood Lodge behind, or had it merely let us go for now, knowing that we would never be free of its grip? As we passed through the town, I caught sight of the sign that marked its borders. I had lived in this place for most of my life, but tonight it felt foreign. The streets, the buildings, everything that had once felt so familiar now seemed distant, unreal. Had the events of the past few days changed us forever? Had we truly escaped, or were we just walking further into the depths of a nightmare? We stopped for gas just outside of town. The station was deserted, the bright lights casting long shadows on the pavement. I went inside to pay, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my bones. But as I stood there, waiting for the cashier to ring me up, I couldn't help but notice something strange. The television on the wall was showing an old broadcast, something about a missing persons case from years ago. The image flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone in the background, a shadowy figure standing just out of view. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced. I quickly paid and rushed back to the car, my mind racing. "What's wrong?" Rachel asked as I slid into the seat. "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking. "I think I saw something inside, on the TV. It was weird." "Just relax," Mark said from the back seat, trying to offer some comfort, though his voice was still tight with tension. "You're just seeing things. We've been through a lot tonight." But I knew I hadn't imagined it. Something was still following us. It wasn't over. I felt it in the pit of my stomach, that knowing, ever-present fear that this wasn't the end. At the hotel, the terror, the darkness hadn't let go of us yet. We continued down the road in silence. The occasional street lamp flickered as we passed, casting brief, intermittent light on the darkened landscape. Each one felt like a countdown, a reminder that we weren't safe. Not really. The road was long, and the world outside the car felt far too vast, too empty. By the time we reached my apartment, the others and I were drained physically, emotionally, mentally. I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them. As we pulled into the parking lot, I knew that none of us would ever be the same. The image of that thing, the sound of its footsteps, its terrible eyes, they would stay with us forever. There was no undoing it, no going back to how things were before. I watched the others drive away, the headlights fading into the night. I wanted to call them, ask if they had experienced the same lingering sensation, the coldness that hadn't left us, but I couldn't bring myself to. What could I say that would make sense of what we had gone through? What could I say that would explain the terror we had witnessed? I went up to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and sank into the couch. The room was still, but it felt wrong. My apartment, once a place of refuge, now felt like another part of that suffocating nightmare. Every creak of the building, every distant sound in the hallway made my pulse quicken. I couldn't relax. Not really. And then, as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, a thought hit me. Something that I hadn't considered before. Was Oakwood Lodge still out there? Had it been the hotel itself that had been cursed, or was it something older, something even more malevolent that had haunted the place for decades? It didn't matter how far we drove, how far we ran. The truth was, some things can never truly be left behind. I could leave Oakwood Lodge, but that didn't mean Oakwood Lodge would leave me. The only thing I could do now was try to forget. Try to pretend that what we had experienced hadn't been real. But even as I thought this, I knew it was a lie. We couldn't outrun what had happened. It would always be with us, haunting our memories, lurking just beneath the surface of every peaceful night, every quiet moment. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, its terrible eyes staring at me from the shadows. The hotel was gone, but the darkness it had left behind was still very much alive. And so, as I sit here, telling you this story, I realize there is no ending. There is no closure. Oakwood Lodge might have been left behind, but it wasn't the hotel that was truly haunted, it was us. It was an ordinary evening, just like any other. I remember it so clearly, the kind of night where everything felt too quiet, yet somehow too normal. The air was cool, the smell of freshly brewed coffee lingering in the kitchen, and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background. I had recently moved into the house, a modest two-story place tucked away on the edge of town. The house had a history, but nothing particularly strange. Just an old, somewhat neglected structure with its share of creaks and groans typical for a house of its age. The kind of place you would walk into, feel a draft, and shrug it off as nothing more than time doing its work. I was living alone, at least for the time being. I had been working from home for a couple of months, and though I was still getting used to the isolation, it wasn't too bad. The house had plenty of space, and I filled it with small things, pictures, furniture, bookshelves, and an oddly large collection of old clocks I had inherited. But aside from the occasional tick-tock echoing through the empty rooms, nothing ever felt out of the ordinary. The kind of peace most people crave after a busy day. It was a Friday, and I had just gotten back from running errands. Nothing major, just grabbing groceries and picking up some tools I had ordered online. I was planning to spend the evening fixing up the garden shed out back. The weather had been nice, and I thought a little work in the fresh air might clear my mind. But when I walked in through the front door, I was struck by a strange, yet familiar feeling. Something was off. But it wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It wasn't until later that night that I realized what that feeling was and how it would change everything. The house was a little too quiet. Even though it had that peaceful, still atmosphere, there was something else lurking beneath. Maybe it was just the fact that I had been spending too much time alone, but I felt unsettled. Still, I shook off the odd feeling and went about my usual routine. I cooked a simple dinner, took a shower, and settled down in the living room to catch up on some work. It wasn't until the first sign that something was wrong that I paid more attention. And even then, it seemed so insignificant that I almost dismissed it. But I would soon find out that this was just the beginning of something much more sinister. It was a small thing, a subtle detail. As I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen, I saw it. The door to the basement was slightly ajar. Now, I knew I hadn't left it that way. I had a habit of making sure everything was locked up tight before heading to bed. But there it was, wide enough to let a sliver of light slip through. I stood there for a moment, looking at the door, wondering if I had simply forgotten to close it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't been near the basement in hours. In fact, I hadn't even thought about it since I moved in. Curiosity nudged me, and I walked over to it. I pushed the door open the rest of the way and looked down into the darkness below. The basement, like the rest of the house, was old. The stairs creaked underfoot, and the air smelled musty. Nothing out of the ordinary. But as I stared into the shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. I closed the door quickly, telling myself it was just my imagination. I locked it, double-checked it, and went back to what I was doing. But that nagging feeling lingered. It wasn't until the following night that I would learn just how wrong I was about the basement and how far the unsettling feeling in my house could reach. The second evening after the door to the basement had mysteriously been left ajar, the air in the house felt different. It wasn't something I could explain easily, just a tension that seemed to hang in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was subtle at first. The house felt heavier somehow, as though the walls had grown thicker overnight, pressing in around me. I chalked it up to nerves. After all, I was new to the place, still getting used to the quiet. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. And that night, I would find out just how wrong I was. It started with the clocks. Now, I know what you're thinking, clocks are just clocks, right? Ticking away the minutes, keeping everything in order. But ever since I'd moved in, I'd been oddly fixated on them. It wasn't that I had an obsession or anything, but there was something about the rhythm of them. The sound was constant, a comforting background noise that I had gotten used to. In fact, it was one of the few things that kept the house from feeling too empty, too quiet. The ticking was like a heartbeat, steady and familiar. That night, as I sat down to read in the living room, something caught my attention. The clocks, all of them, had stopped, all at once. I glanced at the mantel where one of the larger clocks sat, its hands frozen at exactly 9:03. The wall clock by the kitchen was stuck at 8:47, and the old cuckoo clock, which had always been a bit finicky, was eerily silent. For a moment, I thought the batteries must have all gone dead at the same time, but that seemed highly improbable, especially for all of them to stop at once, at nearly the same time. I rose from my chair, walked over to the nearest clock, and nudged it. The hands didn't budge. The silence was deafening. Confused, I checked the others. Same result. No ticking, no movement. The quiet was oppressive. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence, maybe the result of an electrical issue or a weird quirk of old devices. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The house, which had felt so quiet and calm before, now felt tense. I couldn't pinpoint it, but the silence seemed more sinister now. I decided to take a walk around the house, trying to clear my head. The night had settled in thick, casting long shadows down the hallways, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. I stopped at the basement door again, remembering the odd way it had been left open the night before. My heart thudded in my chest as I glanced toward the stairs, but I quickly turned away. I wasn't about to revisit that fear just yet. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and grabbed a glass of water, trying to steady my nerves. But that's when I heard it. A low, soft creak from upstairs. It was so faint that I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, a slow, deliberate creak, as though someone was walking across the floor above me. I froze, my glass halfway to my lips. It wasn't the house settling. No, this was different. I could almost feel the weight of the footsteps as they moved across the floor above me. I wasn't alone. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly set the glass down on the counter and stood perfectly still, straining to hear more. Nothing, just the deafening silence. I stood there, my pulse racing, waiting for another sound, but none came. The house was silent once more. Too silent. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably just the house creaking an old building after all, but the sound had been too clear, too deliberate. Something was wrong. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew. I decided to investigate. Slowly, I made my way up the stairs, my feet light against the old wooden steps, which groaned under my weight. The hallways above were dimly lit by the moonlight spilling through the windows. The air felt colder up here, colder than it should have been. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I glanced down the darkened hallway. I checked each of the rooms. The guest bedroom was empty, as was the small office I had set up at the end of the hall. Nothing unusual. But the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger as I moved through the rooms. It was inescapable, like something was lurking just beyond my sight. I finally reached the master bedroom, where I had been sleeping since I moved in. The door was ajar, the light from the hallway casting long shadows across the room. I pushed it open and immediately froze in my tracks. Something was out of place. The bed, which I had made earlier that morning, was now disheveled. The sheets were tangled, as though someone had been in it. But I had been gone all day, and I hadn't touched the bed since I left. A chill ran down my spine. There was no way anyone had been in here, not without me hearing them. I walked into the room, scanning every corner. And then I saw it. On the nightstand, the clock I had left on the table was now ticking again. But it wasn't just ticking. It was erratically speeding up and slowing down, as though it couldn't decide whether it wanted to move forward or back. The hands were spinning in a chaotic dance, twisting around at impossible angles. I reached out to stop it, but just as my fingers brushed the clock, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I pulled my hand back quickly, startled by the sudden change in atmosphere. The clock stopped once more, its hands frozen in time. I stared at the clock for what felt like an eternity, unable to process what I had just witnessed. I should have been frightened, terrified even, but something else was rising within me, a mix of confusion and curiosity, a need to understand what was happening in this house. I walked out of the room, feeling more unsettled than before. The house, with its strange creaks, its broken clocks, and its sense of being watched, now felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. But I was determined to get to the bottom of it. Whatever was happening here, I needed to know. I couldn't shake the thought that the house was hiding something just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. But as I made my way back down the stairs, the thought of the basement crossed my mind again. The door had been left open the night before, and now I couldn't ignore the pull to investigate further. The house was hiding something, and I was going to find it. The days that followed were nothing short of unnerving. Every corner of the house seemed to hold its breath, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond my perception. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. I had moved to this old house to start fresh, to find peace and solitude. But what I had found instead was something far more unsettling, a presence that seemed to grow stronger each day, tightening its grip on me and the house itself. It started with small things, the kind of things that could easily be brushed aside as coincidences, as the quirks of an old home. At first, it was the windows. Every morning, I'd come downstairs to find one or two of them open just slightly, enough to let in a draft. I didn't remember opening them the night before, but I thought maybe I had absentmindedly left them ajar before heading to bed. A simple mistake, right? The winds could have blown them open, but it didn't stop there. The next night, the windows were open again. This time, I distinctly remembered closing them before I went to sleep. I knew I had, but when I checked the locks, everything seemed normal. No sign of forced entry, no sign of anything out of the ordinary. Yet, the feeling of being watched persisted. The sense of someone or something observing me from the corners of the rooms, from the shadows that seemed to stretch a little too far. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slowly edging closer. Then came the whispers. They started one night, just as I was drifting off to sleep. A soft murmur, so quiet I thought it might have been my imagination. I shook it off, convinced it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder. They weren't clear enough to make out words, but the sound itself was unnerving. A low, almost imperceptible sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It would drift in through the walls, the floorboards, the air itself, curling around me like a cold breath. Sometimes I would hear them just as I was about to fall asleep, and sometimes they would wake me in the dead of night. I would lie frozen in bed, straining to hear, but by the time I gathered the courage to move, the sound would disappear. One evening, after a particularly long day of strange occurrences, I found myself standing in front of the basement door again, the door that I had told myself to avoid. The door that had been left ajar the first night I noticed something wasn't right. It felt like the house was trying to tell me something, trying to lead me to it. The basement, with its damp, musty air, felt like the center of it all, like the very heart of the house's secrets. I had spent days trying to ignore it, trying to keep my distance. But now, standing in front of it, I couldn't resist. I had to know what was down there. I had to understand why everything felt so wrong. With a deep breath, I grasped the cold metal handle and pulled the door open. The air that hit me was heavy, thick with the smell of mildew and old wood. The light at the top of the stairs flickered, casting shadows that danced eerily across the walls. I hesitated, the back of my neck prickling with an all too familiar sense of dread. But something pushed me forward, some primal instinct that urged me to continue. I stepped down into the basement, each creak of the wooden steps amplifying the silence around me. The space was damp and cold, the walls lined with boxes and old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The light from above barely reached the bottom, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch into every corner, hiding something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. I scanned the basement, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. There was nothing here, just old furniture, a stack of forgotten boxes, and the overwhelming scent of decay. But then I noticed something. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden behind an old wardrobe, was a door I had never seen before. It was small, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the old furniture, but it was there. I had been in this basement countless times over the past few weeks, and I was sure I had never seen this door. It looked out of place, as if it had been there for years, untouched, forgotten by everyone except the house itself. I approached it cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no handle, no knob, just a simple wooden door, set into the wall like it had always been part of the house. I reached out to touch it, my fingers grazing the cool wood, and immediately I felt it, an energy, a pulse, emanating from behind it. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it was there. The same sensation I had felt the first time I noticed the door ajar, the sensation that something was waiting for me. Before I could act, I heard it again. A whisper. This time, louder, clearer. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to look behind me. There was no one there. The basement was empty. I was alone. The whisper came again, this time so close I could almost feel the breath on the back of my neck. Leave now. You're not welcome here. I recoiled, instinctively taking a step back. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. I turned toward the stairs, but just as I reached the first step, I heard a loud crash from behind me. I whipped around, panic rising in my chest. The wardrobe, one that had been sitting quietly in the corner, had tipped over, its contents spilling across the floor in a chaotic mess. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the sound of something scraping against the wood. Something large, dragging itself across the floor. Leave now. I didn't need to be told twice. My feet flew up the stairs, every step bringing me closer to the safety of the main floor. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my breath ragged, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had I just heard? What had I just witnessed? But as I reached the top of the stairs and turned toward the hallway, I saw something else. A shadow. At the far end of the hall, near the entrance to the living room, stood a figure. It was dark, indistinct, too dark to make out any real shape, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. I froze, unable to move, my eyes locked on the shadow. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. It was as if the figure had never been there at all, like it was just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I had seen it, I had felt it, and it wasn't going to let me leave so easily. The house was awake now, and whatever it was not going to let me forget what was hidden behind that door. That night, the air was thick with an unbearable silence, a heavy quiet that hung over the house like a shroud. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart pounding in my chest, my mind replaying the events of the past few days. The whispers, the figure in the hallway, the shadow in the basement, none of it made sense. None of it felt real, but it was, and it was only getting worse. I had tried everything to dismiss it. I told myself it was all in my head, that the house was just old and creaky, that the stress of moving had gotten to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was a presence in this house, something that didn't belong. It was getting stronger, more insistent, and I was terrified. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. My thoughts raced in a frenzy, and I knew there was only one place I could go for answers: the basement. The door, the one I had avoided for so long, was calling to me. It was the source of all this, the heart of whatever was happening in this house. I had to open it. I had to face whatever was on the other side. The house was eerily still as I crept out of bed. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could hear the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet as I tiptoed down the hallway, each step sending a shiver down my spine. The basement door loomed in the distance, its dark outline barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. It felt like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to approach. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. My hand hovered in midair, trembling, unsure if I was ready to confront whatever waited behind that door. But the moment stretched out, the silence pressing in on me, and I knew I had no choice. With a deep breath, I twisted the handle and opened the door. The basement was dark, colder than it had ever been before. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, but there was something else, something sharp, like the tang of rust or something decaying in the walls. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me sounding louder than the last. I was too focused on the door at the far end of the basement to notice the strange sounds around me. The low groan of the house settling, the scrape of something moving just out of sight. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw it again, the door. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a portal, a doorway to something beyond, something that shouldn't exist. The air around it crackled with energy, the darkness behind it deeper than anything I had ever seen. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, my body tense with fear. The whispers were back now, louder, more urgent, rising from somewhere deep within the house. I could feel them tugging at the edges of my mind, trying to pull me in, trying to make me listen. Go back. The voice was louder now, clear, unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command, a warning. But it didn't come from anywhere I could see. It seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. My skin prickled as I felt the weight of its presence, the pressure in the room increasing with every passing second. You don't belong here. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to turn and run, to flee back upstairs, to lock myself away from whatever this was. But something kept me rooted to the spot. I needed to know what was behind that door. I needed to understand. With shaking hands, I reached for the handle. It was cold, ice cold, like it had been waiting for me, like it was ready to be opened. My fingers wrapped around it, and I twisted, the door creaking loudly as it swung open. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in. It was empty, save for a single object in the center of the room. A mirror, large and old, its frame ornate and tarnished with age. The glass was cracked, fractured into jagged lines that spider-webbed across its surface. But what caught my attention wasn't the mirror itself. It was the reflection. It was me, but not the way I was standing there now. No, this was a different version of me, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared back at me with an unnatural intensity. The reflection wasn't right. It was wrong, twisted, as if something was trying to escape through the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my body paralyzed with terror. The figure in the mirror moved, its eyes following mine, its mouth opening in a silent scream. And then, it spoke. You should never have come here. The words were a low, guttural growl, like something ancient and malevolent was using the reflection to communicate with me. My breath caught in my throat as the reflection of myself grinned an impossibly wide grin that stretched too far across its face, its teeth sharp and jagged. I stumbled back, falling against the basement wall, my mind reeling, my senses overwhelmed. The room felt colder, the darkness pressing in on me like a weight I couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, each one more urgent, more desperate than the last. Get out. Leave. It's not too late. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare at the reflection, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that was me but wasn't. My chest tightened, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin. It was as if the reflection was pulling me in, as if the mirror itself was a gateway to something much worse, something that wanted to drag me into its depths. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? The figure in the mirror tilted its head, its smile widening impossibly, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You're already here." The words sent a chill through me, colder than anything I had ever felt. And then, in a flash of movement, the figure in the mirror reached out its hand, slamming against the glass with a force that sent a shockwave through my body. I screamed, stumbling back, my heart racing as the mirror cracked, its surface splintering into 1,000 shards. But the figure didn't disappear. It didn't vanish with the broken glass. No, it was still there, still watching me, its eyes locked onto mine. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows swallowing me whole. I couldn't move, couldn't escape. And then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A shape, a shadow, a figure, tall and hunched, with a face that was half hidden in the darkness. It was real. It was standing there, watching me. I could feel its gaze, its presence, suffocating me, drowning me in fear. I knew in that moment that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't in control. Whatever had been waiting in that room was now in the house with me, and there was no escape. The house felt different the moment I stepped back into the hallway. The air was heavier, laden with the oppressive weight of what I had just experienced. My heart was still racing, my body trembling from the shock of what I had seen in that basement, what I had almost let consume me. The figure in the mirror, the whispers, the shadow, it was all real, and it was in the house with me now. I didn't know how, I didn't know why, but I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I ran. My legs felt weak beneath me, but my instincts screamed that I needed to get out. I didn't even look back as I charged up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My eyes darted from side to side, my mind frantically racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had unfolded in that basement. The mirror had been a doorway, a bridge between this world and whatever dark entity had been lurking beneath the surface of this house. And now it was in my reality. It was watching me. The upstairs felt eerily quiet. Too quiet. The house, once a familiar, safe space, now felt like a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of the air sent me into a blind panic. I couldn't trust the walls, the windows, the rooms. I couldn't trust anything in this house anymore. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I fumbled with the door. The lock clicked open with a sound that was almost too loud in the silence. My eyes flicked back toward the hallway, toward the stairs that led down to the basement, but I couldn't stay. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house. I couldn't wait another second. I bolted out the door and into the night, the cool air rushing over my skin like a sharp, cleansing breeze. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts spinning with all that had just happened. What had I seen? What had I almost let into my life? I didn't know. I couldn't make sense of it. The drive was a blur. I didn't even remember the road as I sped through the empty streets, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me. But there was nothing. Just the dim reflection of my own face, pale and haunted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me, still watching. The house, the basement, the mirror, none of it was left behind. It was all still there, clinging to me like a shadow, a weight I couldn't escape. I pulled into a hotel parking lot, the harsh lights illuminating the building like a sterile beacon. It was far from perfect, but it was a sanctuary. I needed somewhere to breathe, somewhere to clear my head. I wasn't sure how long I had been driving, but I couldn't go back. I couldn't face that house again. Inside the room, I locked the door behind me, just in case. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop thinking about the basement, about the mirror, about the shadow that had stood in that room with me. I tried to tell myself that I was safe now, that I had escaped, but the truth was, I felt just as trapped. The thing that had been in the house with me wasn't going to let me go. It had found me. It had seen me. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't outrun it. The hours stretched on, the silence of the hotel room oppressive in its own way. I tried to distract myself, to force my mind away from the images of the broken mirror, the smiling reflection, the cold, unfeeling shadow. But nothing worked. It was like the events from the house had left a mark on me, a stain I couldn't wash away. My mind kept replaying the worst moments, the whispers, the figure in the basement, the moment the door had opened, and I had come face to face with something that shouldn't have existed. My pulse quickened again, the fear returning in full force. But I couldn't stay in the hotel forever. I knew that. I couldn't keep running from the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. I had to go back. I had to confront what was waiting for me in that house. If I didn't, I'd never have peace. The lingering dread, the constant fear, everything would haunt me until I faced it head on. By morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to return. I couldn't live with the uncertainty, the unanswered questions. I needed closure. I drove back to the house, my stomach a knot of anxiety. The sun was up now, the light filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across the driveway. The house didn't seem as menacing in the daylight, but I knew better than to trust appearances. The house wasn't just a building, it was something more, something that couldn't be explained by simple logic. When I walked up the front steps, I hesitated at the door. The house felt still, too still, as if it were holding its breath. I stood there for a moment, the key heavy in my hand, wondering if I should just turn around and leave. But I had to know. I had to face whatever had been haunting me. The door creaked open with a soft groan, and I stepped inside. The house was silent, the air thick with the sense of something waiting. The hallway stretched out before me, dark and empty. I moved cautiously, every footstep echoing in the silence, until I reached the basement door. It was closed. The silence in the house was suffocating, but I felt a strange pull toward the door, toward the darkness below. I opened the door. The basement was exactly how I remembered it, cold, dim, and empty, save for the single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, uneven shadows. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my heart pounding. The mirror wasn't there. The reflection, the shadow, it was gone. The room felt normal, almost too normal. It was as if nothing had ever happened, but I knew better. I walked over to where the mirror had once been, my hands trembling as I touched the cold floor beneath me. There were no shards of glass, no remnants of the cracked mirror. It was as though the space had been erased, wiped clean, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. I turned slowly, scanning the basement once more, but there was no sign of the figure, no hint of the dark presence that had been there. It was as if it had never been. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had been in this house wasn't gone. It was still here. It was still watching. And even though the house seemed empty, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed, that something was waiting for me to make the wrong move. I left the basement, locking the door behind me. I knew that I hadn't truly escaped. I hadn't resolved anything. The fear, the unease, the sense of being watched, it would stay with me, lingering like a shadow at the edges of my vision. I didn't know what was real anymore, what had happened and what hadn't. All I knew was that the house wasn't done with me. It would never let me go. And as I walked out of the front door for the last time, I knew that no matter how far I ran, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that house, I'd never truly be free of it. The shadow would always follow me, just out of reach, waiting for the moment when it could finally pull me back into the darkness. The house would never forget me. I never went back to that house. For months, I couldn't bring myself to step foot near it again. I tried to bury the memories, to move on with my life, as though nothing had happened. But that's the thing about fear, it doesn't let you go. No matter how much time passes, no matter how far you run, it clings to you, festers in the corners of your mind, waiting to resurface when you least expect it. I moved to a different town, settled into a small apartment, and went through the motions of living. But the quiet moments, the ones where the world seems to pause for just a second, were always the hardest. In those moments, I could feel it. That presence, that thing that had been in the house with me, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness. I could never shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting for the right time to return. Every reflection that I passed made me flinch. Every mirror seemed to hold something more than just my own image. I started avoiding them. I couldn't look into them without feeling that creeping unease, that cold sense of being observed. And it wasn't just the mirrors. It was the dark corners of my new apartment, the strange sounds in the middle of the night. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the silence. Sometimes I would hear the faintest whisper, a murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. But when I would sit up and turn on the light, there would be nothing, no one. Just the oppressive stillness of the night. The fear that had once been confined to that house had followed me, seeping into every part of my life. It made me question everything I knew. Was I losing my mind? Was I imagining these things? Or was there something out there, something darker and far more sinister than I could understand, still looking for me? I tried to find answers. I read books, searched forums, listened to other people's stories, hoping to find something that could explain what had happened to me. But every time I thought I had a grip on it, the doubt would creep back in. What if I was just being paranoid? What if I had exaggerated everything in my mind? What if I was just like the people I read about, the ones who convinced themselves they had experienced something supernatural, only to realize later that it was all in their heads? But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something in that house, something that wasn't just a trick of the mind, something that defied explanation. And as much as I wanted to move on, as much as I wanted to forget, I couldn't. The house had left its mark on me, a scar that would never fade. A few weeks ago, I received a message that shook me to my core. It came from an old friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. He had heard about the house from mutual acquaintances and wanted to know if I was okay. Apparently, the house had changed again. The new owners had found something in a strange, hidden door beneath the floorboards in the basement. And when they opened it, they found the same mirror I had seen, the same cracked, broken mirror that had somehow been waiting. I didn't reply to the message. I didn't need to know. The thought of the mirror, of that dark presence, still being there, made my blood run cold. I couldn't understand it. How could something like that still exist? How could it have lingered in the house after I had left, after I had tried to destroy it by simply leaving? But I wasn't surprised either. In some way, I knew it had never truly been gone. How could it be? I've tried to convince myself that I'm fine now. I try to tell myself that whatever was in that house, whatever I encountered, was just a moment in time, something that would fade as I got older. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving too quickly, a reflection that's just a little too still. And in those moments, I know that it's still out there, that it never truly left. I don't know how long it will follow me. Maybe it's just in my head, or maybe it's something darker. Maybe it's something that will wait until I'm weak, until I'm vulnerable, and then it will come for me. Or maybe it will never come for me at all. Maybe it's content just to watch, to linger at the edges of my life, a reminder of that house and the terrible thing I saw.